But I'm just going to give the ball over to Grimbo and we'll just get started to not waste any time.
Yeah, all right, let's dive in. So just as a quick introduction about what we're going to be talking about in the podcast. So some kind of some headings here. We're going to be talking about hard mode, leading it off, and how that's relevant to the core game, which I'm sure we're all very curious about. We've heard a lot about it. There's been a lot of memes about it, so let's hear how it's going to relate to us. We're going to be talking about items and crafting. It's going to be a good one. End game and aspirational content, skill balance, and economy. And to get the ball rolling, I'll shoot us off right here, Cris. So in previous podcasts, you've talked a lot about hard mode, which has some people worried that the development focus is going to shift to this game mode, and it'll be essentially removing something from the core player experience. So can you explain a little bit about how this mode is going to benefit players who don't intend to play it?
So there are a few benefits of hard mode for people who don't intend to play hard mode. The first thing is that and this is the thing that excites me quite a lot, is that it allows us to test core assumptions about things in the economy in a pretty clean environment. We can check, for example, what the ratio should be of stuff that you find on the ground versus craft by making this mode where we can entirely raise or lower the relative benefits of dropped items or crafted items in a pretty clean way. There's not a lot going on, and so it's easy for us to isolate certain things. And so that's really useful for us trying to find a good state for the main complex version of the game that has so many systems and so much existing item expectation in it. And so as a testing ground, that works really well for us. The second thing is that it's also a philosophical check on how content should be handled internally. So what we've done with hard mode is we stripped the game out and we're putting it back in section by section. And as we do, this causes us to have a think about that. And sometimes we find dumb problems we can fix in the main game. And I don't mean broad nerfs or anything. I mean things we can
Está hablando de
in the main game where we realize, well, no one's using
that.
Me ha preguntado.
Básicamente han dicho. Nosotros representamos básicamente a la comunidad detrás de softcore. No ellos tres, es lo que intentan. Y le he preguntado, ¿de qué sirve hard mode a la gente? Nosotros que no lo vamos a jugar, que somos softcore traders. Y básicamente le está diciendo que nos sirve para testear y para reevaluar el contenido que debería estar disponible en el core.
Por si hubiera alguien que no estuvo en el primer podcast, ¿les explico qué es hard mode?
No, dan por hecho que lo saben.
That's a terrible idea, you're a terrible person, blah, 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 and it gets pretty heated. And they're not necessarily blaming us for once, but the two groups of players are blaming each other for having different views. And so hard mode existing lets us go a bit easier on the main game. The Chris's vision stuff can kind of live there to some extent. And the next thing is that it's also a good experimentation ground, because if we want to try something radical, if we do that experiment in the core game, it will cause people to be angry if the experiment succeeds or fails or whatever. So hard mode is a place where we're saying, look, this thing's basically permanently in beta. There might be mid-league nerfs. We're just going to change stuff, right? You get to kind of ride the cutting edge of, whatever insanity is coming out of our mouths at the time. And so that lets us do quite radical experiments that we wouldn't normally put in the main game. So my point here is, even if you don't intend to play hard mode, you do benefit from it existing and allowing us to do all of those various
por
things.
mucho lo llames hard mode, lo estás presentando como un servidor de testeo. Voy a tener un servidor de testeo donde voy a hacer todo lo que me dé la gana.
This is essentially part of Exile's PTR, public test realm. Does that sound about right?
Ahí está.
Well, it's a different experience.
Es que estás haciendo un servidor público de testeo.
Use it to some extent like a PTR for specific features if we feel that those could be
literal. No es lo mismo porque han quitado muchas cosas, pero sí que es un poquito como un PTR, un reino público, como un RPP.
It will just be some crazy masochistically hard version for crazy people.
So a few things here. So can you highlight some of the mechanics in the past that would have been trialed in hard mode already? And maybe a few of the things that you would have planned, like Loot 2.0, is that going to make its way into hard mode first? And can you talk a little bit about that?
So in terms of mechanics to try in hard mode, I'll give you an example of one that we were too scared to try in the main game. Currently, when you get a town, your flasks refill instantly. So you pop up to town and back again, and you're completely healed. And we don't like that at all. We should have done it the way that it was done in Diablo 2, where you have to go and talk to a vendor. Now, when players hear this, they think, what? That's wasting my time. GGG doesn't respect my time. What are you doing? I'm not going to tolerate this. If we patch that in, there would be a riot. And so that's not something we can put in the main game. having said that, that's how it works in hard mode. That's something we're going to throw in there and see. We think it'll make the game better if there's more friction to have the ability to instantly refill your flasks using a portal scroll. It'll make boss fights
Sigue
get less
comparándolo todo el
cheesed and
rato
so
con
on.
Diablo 2.
Now, that's a thing that we can fix in hard mode.
Hombre, es
because
la
that's a
base.
mode where we do
Ya,
fix
pero
that
hace
kind of
23
thing.
años de Diablo
And
2.
if players in hard mode
Yeah.
say, look, we love it, and
Lo
they
vas a
manage
jugar
to
en
somehow
septiembre.
convince the rest of the audience that we want that in the main game, then sure,
Y
we
lo voy
can
a
do
jugar
that. But,
durante
you know, we're
septiembre.
not making any presumption there. Hard mode is not like a
Espero jugar este
complete
durante
testing
septiembre
ground for
y
stuff
octubre y
guaranteed
agosto.
to get into the
Pero
main
bueno,
game. It's
son
just a place
cosas que
where we
ellos
fix
quieren
the
meter,
problem
pero
and
les
say,
dan
in this
miedo.
version of the game that involves playing a little
Van a
bit more
probar
slowly
cómo
and
reacciona la
carefully, not
gente.
cheesing
Si
stuff.
reacciona mal, no lo
That's
meten.
how it is. And another example is the checkpoints, for example. When you die in the calm fight, you pop right back outside the arena, so you can attrition calm literally by walking 3 steps. In hard mode, the checkpoint is pulled back a lot further. And so that's the case of us just gradually preventing the abuse cases in these fights.
Eso es lo que tiene Diablo para revivir en cada vez.
Touch that checkpoint in the main game. Well, I mean, people might try, but we'd probably think very hard before doing that one.
Okay.
What was the second part of your question?
So I was curious what systems that had already been kind of developed and put into the main game that you would have loved to have tested first in hard mode. Potentially maybe the flask system?
I do think if hard mode existed, it's the kind of place where we could potentially try that. The tricky part is hard mode is running on the same source code as the rest of the game. It's really a place for us to have data changes. It's entirely possible for us to have a source code change which detects if you're on hard mode or not and switches the system over, but most of the time it's there for essentially data changes to how the game works. We would ideally like to keep the game systems similar if possible, but we'll do the work to make a hard mode specific version if we need to.
The more I hear about this, the more I feel like the changes that you were looking to do for hard mode feels more like things that are more of a nuisance than hard, like moving the checkpoint back, forced to talk to a vendor for refilling of flasks. I mean, it literally just sounds like it's more of a nuisance than actually a challenge. Because to my understanding, hard mode is supposed to be challenging. It's supposed to make the game feel hard.
No hay ningún reto, lo que estás haciendo es añadir molestias, pero no hay nada difícil, solo molesto.
We're just going to make everything a nuisance to go through.
So games are about friction and opportunity.
Y que además hemos empezado diciendo, vale, no somos jugadores de hardcore, somos de softcore. ¿Qué tal si hablamos de softcore? ¿Qué ha hecho hablar de hardcore?
No, le ha preguntado él. Ha preguntado
le ha preguntado qué beneficio tiene hard mode sobre los jugadores de softcore.
So you had to manually move the items across. That would have exactly the same reaction as being a nuisance. We feel the level of nuisance in the game to make some of the encounters have impact was not at the correct place, and that's something we can fix in hard mode, where the experience that we're offering is one that's somewhat different. The core thing, of course, that you will notice in hard mode, and the thing that will discriminate whether people want to play it, is the extreme item scarcity, right? It's an entirely different game because you're massively under the power curve with regard to items as you play through. The nuisance of having to walk for 7 or 8 seconds in town to heal is really a small thing compared to the fact that you've just got no gear and you're completely struggling to get through the acts before maps and so on. So that'll probably be the defining characteristic. But we will be trying some additional nuisance in places because that's how games are made, really. I mean,
¿Cómo se nota que este tío no juega el 3.15?
ingredient goes in that you don't like, but it is part of the process.
Like, wouldn't it be better to just
que la poti tenga 8 segundos de CD no es nada, lo importante es que no tengas equipo para moverte. ¿Cómo se nota que no juega el 3.15?
But either way, that's like a solution mode. What I wanted to ask was, like, you mentioned the hard mode being mainly a way for you to test things for the community, and we want to focus in this interview on the idea of bringing up the aspect of the perspective of softcore trade. So how is hard mode going to be a good testing ground for changing things that would impact softcore trade players? Because a lot of the things that we go through with the desire of finding a good item,
en ese medio ambiente tan complicado,
the game, or allow you
¿de qué le sirve eso a la gente de softcore que no tienen nada que ver?
For the sake of a trade environment with, you know, thousands upon thousands of people flooding markets with items that people can purchase and buy, right?
The process of making hard mode involves reviewing the way that all the content interacts together, because our intention in that mode is to not have particularly crazy ways of cheesing items that just make the game entirely easy. And that involves us identifying which parts are working and not working in the softcore trade stuff. And so every decision we make in hard mode gives us observations that we then get to apply to the softcore trade league. And so We have two challenges here. In hard mode, make a good item system. That's relatively easy. We have a really clear idea of how to do that. It's quite straightforward. We have all the building blocks there. We just need to take a couple of them away, and that item system will be very compelling. The tricky situation we have in softcore trade is that we want to improve the item system there in a way that doesn't upset the players or subvert expectations of how the game works. Right now, Path of Exile is a really strong power trip where you get a bunch of cool stuff and get to be a god, and we want to retain that feeling in softcore trade leagues. Like the absolute intention is that you still get awesome stuff, kill cool bosses, find more things, and it isn't some incredible mega slog like hard mode would be. But this involves us evaluating each of those systems. From a practical point of view, we will do experiments in hard mode, and then we will look at the data, and that will cause us to make some changes to the way that the main game works. But to be clear, not in the direction of just copying and pasting those hard mode mechanics over. It's things like, if we were to set the power of ground items at this level and the power of crafted items at this level, what is the ratio that people have? Like, we track the items. Out of a given character, how much of their gear came from the ground versus came from crafting? And then we learn and get a good idea. Like, for example, there's a question fundamentally of, should you be able to craft an item?
Para los que estáis viendo esto y no tenéis un buen nivel de inglés o no os enteréis de la mitad, no os preocupéis. Haremos un resumen luego compilado de todos estos podcasts y de lo que ha dicho Cris. Ahora, a no ser que digan algo muy relevante, pocas veces los interrumpiremos.
It sounds like hard mode is going to be fairly instrumental in understanding how loot is going to work in the future.
Sigue diciendo lo mismo, más o menos.
Because it's a big problem right now, which we'll touch on later, I'm sure.
Observar cómo juega la gente le da información sobre
my initial reaction to the hard mode announcement,
básicas del
when we were
juego.
talking about it, was, oh man, this guy is so damn excited about this
integrar
mode.
nuevas
He cannot
cosas y nuevas
wait for
mecánicas
people to play this, which is great. But
y arreglar
what I
el
was
problema que
feeling
tenemos de que hay
is,
demasiada
this guy's
mierda en
the
el
creative
suelo en softcore,
director, of Path of Exile.
sin,
Does he still give a damn about the game that I play?
sin
Is he still
quitar la
thinking about what's
esencia
gonna
del
make, the next
softcore,
expansion
que es
really, really awesome? For the end game of
ir
softcore
consiguiendo
trade
objetos
and,
hasta que te
hardcore
vuelves
and stuff
básicamente
like
un
that?
dios.
Or are you spending a lot of your creative energy on the hard mode stuff now?
Well, I'm actually not the creative director. That's Eric.
Oh, my bad.
Here's the thing. Eric can think creatively about where he wants the game to be and focus on vision, because his vision is always some awesome new content and so on. I do the business stuff. My title is managing director, and the business stuff involves keeping players happy, right? Like, if I make some vision change that makes the game different and loses some players, that's not good. That's not me doing my job well. I have to make sure the existing players are happy. And so that means that something like hard mode, where we're providing a new opportunity for a slightly different player base, an existing player base within Path of Exile, of course. We're not branching out and making the game Fortnite, despite the Battle Royale stuff. Anyway, this is a thing to both satisfy more people and to mean that we can lay off the nerfs in the main game. And the timing is really interesting, actually. Like, there are a lot of people who say, why did you go so far with the nerfs in 3.15 when you already knew you were doing hard mode? Why not just save them all until then? And the answer to that was we legitimately thought that the nerfs we were doing in 3.15 were
atraer a un nuevo tipo de jugador y al mismo tiempo retrasar nerfeos y evaluarlos antes de hacerlo. Evaluarlos bien antes de hacerlos.
I think we've had enough of hard mode. I think it's important that people understand
Va a ser un poco como ir un parche por delante.
The idea of hard mode.
Sí. El balance.
I think that a lot of people just misunderstanding it, like a lot of, like myself and many others were misunderstanding it when we first heard it, and I think we got a pretty good idea of what it is now. So I think more people today
Gimro va a meterle caña,
on par with what
Gimro, por si no lo habéis oído, le ha dicho hace un momento: te veo a ti que eres un mandamás súper motivado con tu hard mode, y pienso, si este tío solo está preocupándose por el hard mode, ¿qué pasa con el modo juego que yo juego, que es el trade?
Mention it if there's a specific reason why we're doing an experiment there that you need to know about for the answer to the question.
Yeah, like items. I think it's incredibly relevant.
Definitely.
All right.
No, pretty much. That brings us to items, basically. So we have a lot of questions about items that we wanted to ask, and we know that you're very passionate about the topic. In the way that you've spoken about items in the past podcasts and things like that. So we'd really appreciate it if you could give us a rundown of your perspective for what's important in items in ARPGs.
So this is something I have a lot of thoughts on. Okay, so the first thing is, we feel that tradability is really important for items. And of course, SSF exists, but tradability in the game is the key thing, because it lets you have this feeling of you playing Path of Exile and you're getting an item and it's just a great drop, like it's an Exalt or it's a mirror or it's some unique that no one else has, and you think to yourself, I have this, and my friends do not have it. They're saying, dude, can I borrow that? Can I have it? And you could absolutely give it to them, but you don't. And so the journey of an action RPG is kind of the power fantasy of finding some treasure that you could absolutely give to your friends if you were generous, but instead you're using it to further your own benefit. It's this kind of... It's something that we worked out only after a lot of Diablo 2 play, that the fact that the items were tradable was a key thing. And then this was demonstrated for us in Diablo 3, where they turned off the ability to trade items except for those that were very recently dropped with your party members. And to me, at least, that completely removed any interest I had in that game. It meant that if I found the ultimate weapon, it's kind of bound to my character. The value of that is merely what I can use it for to kill monsters, as opposed to me having a stash full of stuff that I can then trade for an entire new build. And so tradability is key. And that means that, for example, in Path of Exile's SSF mode, you always have the ability to move the item back into the regular game to try to get value out of it. If you find a mirror there, you bring it back to trade, and you trade it and play that league for a while as an absolute god because of all the exalts you can get. And so tradability is key. Moving on, though, the next thing is that items are random. This means unpredictable base types dropping. You're not just dropping the highest base type all the time. It could be a lower one. You have to make decisions about whether the builds on that actually make it worthwhile. Unpredictable rarity tiers. That means, for example, that the rate of getting unique items and rares and stuff doesn't actually get higher as you go through the game, except through means that you control, like map rarity and so on. Unpredictable mods. You never know what mods the item is going to have. A lot of the time it's bad, even when you're crafting. And so the practical reason why this has to be the case is imagine a normal distribution of items, like a bell-shaped curve graph. And so items are going to occur randomly all over here. So to start out, you're going to get your first item, and it's going to be, say, a 3 out of 10 just by chance, right? And so you put that on, and then another item drops. And because you're still on the low end of the normal distribution, most items are better than a 3. You're going to find like a 4 or a 5 or something, and you upgrade to that. And then as new items come along gradually over time, you're going to occasionally hit ones that are further down the curve. You know, the 8s, 9s, 10s, and so on are rarer relative to the ones you're wearing. And so you gradually have a lower and lower chance of getting an item upgrade. And so this pacing between upgrades, where you get fast, impactful upgrades at the start and smaller incremental upgrades later, is the right progression of power in this kind of game, because you want a person to be playing a game for a long period of time, whether it's days, weeks, or months on the same character during that league. And so if you have a linear power upgrade during there, you have to create masses and masses of content to facilitate weeks of play. And so by its very nature, these systems need to have larger and larger gaps between effective item upgrades. So having a random distribution of items like this helps achieve this. The next thing is no perfect items, right? It's very undesirable for us to have it so that someone finds a rare that is entirely maxed out, because it kind of takes away the what else is there to find in this game. It's basically Path of Exile is over. There's the perfect item. I've got it. You can't have it. Okay, move on. If you find it, you're just the second place person to get it. Is an undesirable thing. And so we have to make sure, and when I say perfect, I mean stat perfect. Of course, it's fine to get something that's 99% as powerful. Like, you know, practically the same item, just not quite there in terms of all of the numbers. And so that way you've still got the holy grail to chase. And we ideally want to have items that are so good that no one has ever seen a screenshot of them. There's still some mythical thing out there that you could potentially get that people haven't lucked into or worked out how to craft. What else is next on the list of things we care about in our item system?
Just on that point, I just wanted to highlight. So a lot of players do consider perfect items to be creatable right now in the current patch. 6 mod, T1 items, exactly how you want it with the current crafting system. How do you feel about that as a game designer? Are you happy with it?
I want it so they can get better items through other means. Now, this doesn't mean we're going to go in there and nerf whatever system it is to make it so that they can't make those items. If we didn't have to take into account player expectations and we were able to pull the game away, fix it up and put it back, and people would be totally happy to play whatever the new version is, absolutely we would make it so they couldn't get perfect items. But a lesson that we have learned many times over the last decade is not to just go and nerf stuff for the sake of the vision, right? Like, people are playing that, they enjoy it. We will provide new ways of getting items that are better, because we do always want the chase to be there. And yeah, we don't see it as good that people can make the perfect items so easily.
I had another one.
Other question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Okay, I'll take it. Just a quick question, because you talk about the idea of this being the rundown of your perspective, what's important for finding items.
Le han dicho, él ha dicho, no pueden haber objetos perfectos. Y se han alterado todo. Le han preguntado, pero ya los hay. Y dice, y sí, y no podemos nerfearlos porque
less value. So
Porque cabrearía a la gente. Así que encontraremos maneras de que siga habiendo algo que puedas perseguir, de que sigas pudiendo mejorar.
On your perspective of what's important for an item system in your ARPG.
I don't think it's quite there at the moment. I think that there are some upgrades on items that are incredibly impactful. Stuff like influence mods, for example, are quite far up there. Having said that, it doesn't need to stick strictly to the rules. It's just that we have to understand what the perfect, mechanical system would look like, and then bear that in mind as we make changes to the game, right? Like, it's okay for there to be bumpiness. Bumpiness where you get an upgrade that's more impactful than you were expecting, or something to look forward to that's a big jump, is okay, because that's kind of what makes things fun. But it's important that you have the scaffolding in place for everything to work correctly before you intentionally put these extra rewards in there. And we're reviewing stuff, right? We're not completely happy with everything. And the good news is a lot of it comes down to itemization in the end game. And a lot of it comes down, we're doing a big end game overhaul for 3.17 anyway. So it's an opportunity for us to make sure to fix a few mistakes there, which I think players will appreciate in a positive way, because there's some good changes we're planning to make. I have plenty more philosophical item stuff on my list if you'd like to hear more.
Oh, absolutely. I just had one thing I just wanted to add in, which I'm just burning to know. I'm sure you've touched on it in the past, but obviously influence items, awakener orbs, and maven orbs, they basically are the complete opposite of finding items on the floor, and they basically serve to make it so that you'll never find the best item on the floor. And they also hamstring your new systems, such as, roll. Like, if you're not rolling an influenced item, it's just not really going to be that good, is it? Can you talk a little bit about influence? And you can maybe, is this going to be around in the future, or do you think it's a problem?
So I think the influence stuff is pretty cool, right? In general, I like it, but it does have the problems that you're describing there. And so that makes me kind of not like it. And so when we're having our discussions about 3.17, the first thing to bear in mind is we're potentially stripping the end game back quite far, right? Like, the intention here is potentially saying that all of the Shaper and Elder and Maven and stuff was taken off the table while we design a new end game on the Atlas and work out where we land. Maybe it involves those bosses still being there in some form. Maybe the war between the Shaper and Elder progresses to the next stage. Maybe there's more Maven-like beings that have arrived. We're still working out the details, and if we knew them, we'd be vague anyway. But influence comes from the Conquerors and so on, right? Like, the influence comes from these existing bosses. It gives us the opportunity to do kind of influence version 2 if we need to. Maybe the solution is that you can find the items on the ground. Maybe the solution is that you just can't craft ones that are better. We don't know yet, but we do want to very much design it so that it's compelling for the players. This is something where, if we screw up a league or screw up a balance change, that has a short-term impact that's negative. But if we screw up the end game or its itemization, that has a very long-term impact until we change it back or whatever. And so this is something we're putting a lot of effort into making sure we do well. And we want to be very exciting when people are finding these items.
Okay.
Shall I continue with the notes about the philosophical item system stuff? So the next topic is deterministic item acquisition. So we've noted it should be used sparingly. And the reason why is we see deterministic item acquisition and crafting as a relatively boring treadmill. As in, because it's deterministic, you know you're working towards an endpoint. You can see what progress you're making, essentially. You know you've got some number of boss runs to do. Maybe you're getting splinters or tokens or something like that that lets you get to a specific goal. And the key thing is that achieving that deterministic goal is not particularly interesting to show off to people. Right? If you say, I have a tabula, I've got a tabula, and they're like, you grinded humility cards for that tabula. You're like, I did, and it took hours. That's not necessarily something as opposed to I found an exalt, and they're like, you're so lucky, I can't. How come you get all the exalts? Every league, first day, 2 exalts, 4 in a row. What are you doing? It's a better experience to find stuff through luck. And we do want determinism to be in the game in many ways. The takeaway here is not Cris hates deterministic crafting, Cris hates deterministic item acquisition, right? We definitely are going to have lots of it in Path of Exile, but we just have to note that fundamentally it is a less exciting thing for you to make progress towards. It's kind of a bread and butter kind of grind. It's like every day I walk on my treadmill for a few hours. I've got to do it to stay healthy. I hate it because it's just boring. It's not exciting, right? If you can put some
Pero prefiere que el juego las trate como van a estar en el juego siempre. Pero prefiere que el juego las trate como algo que no es divertido, que no es
I think we all want to
interesante.
chime in here. Just go ahead, Jesse.
Okay, like the deterministic grinding here, like the fact that you can have a character and you can deterministically grind out the humility cards to get the tabula. You can do that, or you can do chaos recipes running it, but you can deterministically make sure that you can get a tabula by stopping at Act 9, and I think that's a great thing. I think it's absolutely amazing. It's great for new players, it's great for casual players, because they don't need to be lucky to find an Exalted to get that initial 6 link they want to do in maps, or have in maps, right? Instead, they're able to take the decision saying, I'm going to stop here, I'm going to farm Blood Aqueducts to get my tabula, and it might take a few hours, and people appreciate that, people love that. So I'm not sure if I would agree that the majority of the community would appreciate that not being the case. I think it's quite the opposite.
Oh, I'm not saying we're taking that away. I'm just saying fundamentally we think that deterministic item acquisition is a worse system. And this is like, if you compare action RPGs like Diablo 2, which are basically entirely item acquisition that's random, to say World of Warcraft that's honestly got a lot of deterministic stuff in it. We're sitting in the Diablo 2
A ver todo el mundo, lo he vuelto a decir. Segundo chupito.
But I'm not saying we're taking anything away. I'm just saying that we're careful when we put it in there. Like, it was our intention to have tabula be farmable. We did this on purpose. We're happy with that being the case.
Do you want to go next, me, Tina, or me?
No, you can go ahead.
All right. You brought up World of Warcraft. You've seen the GDC on determinism, I'm assuming? Or have you got that one?
Which video you're talking about, sorry?
It's essentially badges of justice and stuff like that in World of Warcraft.
I don't think I've seen that video, and I would like to, so I'll find it.
You should definitely check it out.
Someone email me the link is what I was going to say, but I've learned not to say that, right? Because I don't need 500 copies of the link. I will have it anyway.
Essentially, to sum it up, World of Warcraft went through a similar process where they went from a full random system, which is what we saw in PoE's early days, to deterministic, and then they went to a hybrid approach. So I just want to share a quick anecdote with you about my experience with your random versus determinism. So when you log into the game and you're faced with a fully random system, and let's say that you want to acquire any item in the game, you really have no guidance and no way to acquire that, especially if you're not a heavily experienced player. So if you want to get a bow, how would you go about getting that bow without some form of determinism? And that's when you enter things like, essences of contempt. Okay, so you want a physical bow. You can guarantee one of those modifiers. And like having the ability to kind of use that tool and apply that to your style of play to acquire something you want is actually very empowering as a player. And I think the problem right now is that you offered like maximum power with Harvest, and then you took that away, and now we're kind of trying to find the middle ground here. So can you talk a little bit about what you think the middle ground might be, and is it where we are right now, or a little bit more on the deterministic side? Because a lot of people feel right now that it's not possible to craft an item.
Básicamente ha dicho, nos diste el techo, nos diste lo mejor que se podía con Harvest. Y ahora estamos intentando encontrar el punto medio.
Herramientas como las esencias y demás para hacernos un arco que nos haga falta y aprender a usar esas herramientas y empoderar al jugador aprendiendo a jugar, a usar las herramientas que tiene el juego.
Their needs are met, and if they are saying the current system is not sufficient and they feel frustrated by it, then that's a reason for us to be unhappy with it. In the absence of the players having that opinion, we feel the current system is in an okay place. But the alarm has been raised by the players that they would like more determinism. We're not sure what form that would eventually take, right? There are places where the determinism is possibly still too easy, and there are places where we can make it easier. And it often depends on subtlety to do with exactly what you're making, right? You'll have some of the determinism of Path of Exile comes from things like meta mod abuse or its combination with other crafting systems. And there are cases where, due to the number of prefixes or suffixes available, you can pretty easily craft a specific thing if you basically follow the steps. And there are other cases where, because there are more mods available, there's a huge amount of randomness that's going on there. And so we're kind of reviewing all of this stuff, and it matters in hard mode. Like in hard mode, we have a huge discussion about the presence of essences. What is good and bad about essences? Look at how it all works.
Viene con lo que ha dicho al principio de cómo han estado haciendo hard mode.
And that was incredibly useful because we kind of know that in isolation,
mientras lo estaban haciendo, han estado repasando cosas del juego base. Que les ha servido para darse cuenta de determinadas cosas que habían hecho hace mucho tiempo.
Sí, pero lo que decía Cris del hard mode al principio era, no, yo cojo 4 cosas, las desactivo y ya está.
Vaya.
No, ahora se han puesto a trabajar bien.
So that's the kind of thing that we're evaluating and going forward. Now, there's no firm answers in my answer here, right? I cannot tell you exactly what changes we're making to the core item system to address it, but it's a topic we talk about every day.
Vale, a grosso modo está diciendo que hay determinadas recetas que son como demasiado deterministas, demasiado sencillas, sabe los mods que te pueden salir y sí o sí te va a salir ese mod, y otras que son como demasiado aleatorias porque hay demasiados mods. Algunas pretenden hacerlas más fáciles y otras menos deterministas, pero van a tocar el sistema de crafteo.
Carry on.
Okay, well, there's just a couple of other small points left. So after the big determinism rant, The other thing we came into Path of Exile philosophically wanting to get right was a lot of the small detail about how like mods on items work with regard to, on rare items, the way you want to stack, multiple different ED mods to get numbers that spike higher than the individual ranges and so on. So we had quite a lot of that stuff, which is honestly pretty similar to how things worked in, games like Diablo 2. And so despite the game having moved on quite a lot since then, we still try very hard to review those initial philosophies of how mods on items work. What's a prefix, what's a suffix, how blocking works between those, and make sure that they are upheld, even when we're designing new mods to go on items. There's quite a lot of thought. Right now, there's a bit of a defensive overhaul happening behind the scenes as a result of some community concern with defenses recently, and so there's much discussion about what's a prefix and a suffix and how these things stack together and so on, and what item slots things go on, and so on and so on. There's a lot of care that we've done there. For example, run walk, right? That occurs on boots, clearly, because that's where it goes. But there are some action RPGs where they say, you can get run walk on any slot. Right? Why not? They just don't understand that it should be on boots. And so we kind of feel thematically it's a boot thing, and maybe you could get it on amulets in certain situations, or various unique items. And so we're very careful philosophically to stick to those initial rules that we set back in 2006. And the other thing that I have on the list before we can get on with the other questions is with unique items. So they're a thing that have a deterministic outcome, as in the unique item does a unique thing and there's little randomness to it. But that randomness is important because that unique item exists on a normal distributed curve, just like any rare, where you have various properties of how it can be better.
Por sacar una tabular en un sitio de farmeo de tabulas no me parece bien.
On the item, you have the ability to muck around
Sí, eso sí te parece bien,
no
hace un mal
ejemplo. To do synthesis stuff on the unique.
Eso está hecho aposta, lo ha dicho
we try very hard to create it that even though you want your slot to be a specific
pero intenta que
effect, there's like a mini item system
lo excitante sea... Me ha caído una exalte de a ti no, jaja, eso sea lo...
ways to craft it to be slightly better or
el tope.
Than the bog standard unique that you get from,
o me ha caído un corte, que eso me ha caído algo.
Anyway, sorry for the long rant, but that's philosophically an example of the kind of things we think about with the item system. It's a bit all over the place, and they're mostly rules that we try to stick to where we can, but as you've noticed, there is quite a lot of determinism in modern Path of Exile that we probably didn't intend there to be there on day one, and that determinism has been beneficial to the game, right? We are learning that whenever we add a way for players to reliably get something, there is benefit to that. We don't want it so they can reliably get everything, and we have to be careful with the ratio of this, and that's a lot of the reason we're doing planning in hard mode for this. But yeah, don't get the impression that we're anti-determinism, right? We love the fact that players are
no os creáis que somos antideterministas. Amamos el determinismo en determinados aspectos, pero tenemos que llevar mucho cuidado a la hora de hacer accesible el juego mediante crafteos deterministas.
Well, the follow-up question.
Porque quieren que sigan habiendo esos momentos de me ha caído un exalte, me ha caído un...
Ese me ha tocado la lotería.
Exacto, esos momentos de me ha tocado la lotería.
Sort of having this perfect item that you show to your friends, and it's like, oh yeah, I've got one too, you know. So it's sort of like that didn't feel great, but at the moment, I find that because a lot of those things are taken away, it feels like some of the items that still do have this formulaic way of creating them end up being the only items that are actually available on the market, sort of restricting the variance of items which was present before Harvest was there. But I don't think either before was the way to go, and I don't think currently is the way to go either, if you know what I mean. It feels like we're sort of stuck in this meta where we
Cris
have
debe ser un ludópata de cuidado.
Like
No tengo pruebas, pero tampoco dudas.
They're merging together, and we're only getting one type of item out of it as an outcome because it's the path of least resistance. So you'll always see, boots with someone finishes the suffixes and then just puts a redeemer orb, gets elusive, and that's it. That's all boots on the market. So we get stuck with this sort of stale meta of items which are all very similar to each other because that is the best way to make that item.
Yeah, this is the economic effect you see where if you have multiple, like let's say in the real economy, you have multiple companies trying to compete to make the same kind of product. The one that finds the most efficient method of doing that costs the least money, in this case the least orbs, is the one that is able to produce that and dominates the market. And so you're getting this thing here where all of the copies of the item available for trade are using the easy method and no one's using, say Chaos Spam or some old school inexpensive, inefficient way of making the item. And yeah, you're completely right. And I'm not blaming Harvest as much for that as the interaction with other game systems. It's amazing when we were looking at the abuse cases of how you can make items. It's amazing how many different things are interacting together. And to some extent, this is kind of the beauty of Path of Exile. Like, we put these things in there so players could work out these crazy combinations, and then it seems unreasonable for us to then be angry that that's what they're doing. But we do want to have it so it's more interesting and more varied, so that there's more than one way of making a good pair of boots or whatever. And that's a lot of the goal of what we're trying to evaluate with the item system at the moment.
Pero es que ya tienes más de una manera de hacer los ítems.
Pero estaba hablando de que solo hay una buena y es real. Hay la manera normal, o sea, la manera buena, que es la barata, que es la que hace todo el mundo, y las 13 maneras caras que no hace nadie porque no puedes competir porque es un juego de traders. Y está hablando de que intenta hacer varias maneras de llegar al mismo objeto que sean equivalentes.
Completely, and they don't have, or in some cases, or more cases, they aren't even aware of the tools that are needed to fix their progression, which is tied mostly to one of the three features of actually upgrading your character, which is skill gems, passive tree, or gear. Now, skill gems can only go so high, and passive tree is one skill passive point per level. So most of this is all about items, which is the main topics we're talking about right now. And the problem with this is that we talk about specific ores allowing us to do higher-end crafting.
Que hay un problema enorme porque no está claro el camino que tienes que seguir para progresar.
And the earlier stage of crafting you get into, the less deterministic it is. It just becomes a, it's a terrible display of gambling RNG to try to get it. Chaos or spamming, or in best case scenarios, you might have a couple of essences, and that's your only solution to progress your character, which then prevents these players from having a clear vision of their progression of upgrading their character. And that
tienes X niveles y X puntos de pasivas. Y tus gemas están limitadas, no las puedes subir por encima de ese nivel. Tu único margen de progresión es el equipo, son los ítems y son las herramientas de gambleo. ¿Cómo vas a progresar el personaje?
And a note to add to this is that Harvest was ultimately the player's choice for the solution to this problem, which to me is a band-aid solution and doesn't actually deal with the core problem. What's your thoughts on it?
So there are a lot of different brick walls in Path of Exile for character progression, right? Like, we've hit people who can't find the final Uber lab and, can't find the final Uber trial and hence can't do the Uber lab and get the power there. We have people who aren't able to get a 6-link, for example. They get a whole bunch of fusings and just
pillar un 6-link, hacer el Uber lab, son formas de progresar el personaje.
Vale, bienvenido Casual. Depending on which one they encounter. Now, the purpose of us making Path of Exile is to throw out a set of challenges, right? We say, here's some bosses, here's some tools. We never tell players, you have to go and get a 6-link, right? It's obviously better for them to do so, but there's costs associated with that. The mana cost is high if you have a lot of support gems going on. We try very hard never to tell players how to play. We just put lots of tools out there, release new tools every expansion, put some new challenges out there, and then let players work out the solution. And in the Harvest case, for example, we never told players, here is specifically how you craft crazy items in Harvest. They worked that out. Now,
nuestra filosofía es darte las herramientas, pero nunca decirte cómo lo tienes que hacer. Que tú lo descubres.
The ultimate determinism is trade, right? Trade lets you get random items by paying currency, and you get currency in a relatively deterministic way, right? Like this. Literally just playing it up. There's chaos recipes. If you just need a pile of chaos, there are ways you can get that, like grinding out a tabula.
Está hablando de mí.
And then you take that
Consigo una buena pila de caos y eso es lo más determinista del mundo. Coges y compras cualquier ítem super terminado.
Determinism can be boring sometimes, but this
y dice que eso es aburrido, no campeón, yo me divierto.
Playing solo self-found, for example, has the ultimate determinism available to solve these kind of problems. Theoretically, any brick wall that a trade player can run across, they can solve using time, and that's kind of inefficient, of course, compared to doing it the correct way that a pro player would do. But it does mean that knowledge aside, there is a path through each problem.
If I understand your take on this, you're saying that by playing trade, you can overcome these obstacles because you have access to trade. That's essentially what you're saying, right?
It's a tool you have available that certain players don't have available, yeah.
I think that's fair. The problem that this presents is when you're playing a non-meta build. Because then, like, the problem with the way the market works in trade is that when a meta build emerges and the majority of players are playing a 1 out of 3 builds, right? People craft for that, and they have the tier items, the high tier items are up here. They're super expensive. And then you have an insane amount of great items. And because that pool of items is so big, that becomes a buyer's market. Because of the simple fact that the supply is higher than the demand. So when people are then grinding their deterministic currency to purchase any of these great items, they are able to do so. And they're therefore pretty easily, or with a lower amount of currency, purchase items that lets them bypass this brick wall. And if you then look at that kind of aspect on a non-meta build, you have the problem where almost no one is crafting for your build that you're playing. If you want to purchase it, the item doesn't exist. And if it does exist, it's extremely expensive, which requires you to drop things that like multiple exalteds or farming that kind of currency, which is very detrimental for new players.
Hay un problema enorme
con
lo que ha dicho él, y es las cosas, las builds meta, las builds que funcionan, tienen muy caros los objetos excelentes, los objetos aceptables los tienen buenos.
Y los hay en el mercado y hay bastante demanda.
Porque la gente craftea para esas builds que sabe todo el mundo que funcionan. Pero si no juegas una build de esas, te encuentras con una pared porque o no existe el objeto literalmente, o existe pero como no hay demanda es absurdamente caro. Y entonces yo tengo que gastarme mucho más dinero para llegar al mismo nivel que tú en la build meta. Y me cuesta más progresar y me cuesta más sacar dinero. Es una bola de nieve. Por no haber elegido la super build.
Now, we often have supply and demand arguments presented to us, and we believe strongly that we should never mess around with this kind of stuff in the economy, right? Like, it's essentially government regulation. For us to come in and say, this build is too expensive, let's make it cheaper, is something that we don't want to do. We want to throw tools out there with arbitrary rarities and throw ways of getting currency and ways of getting items and let the market sort itself out. We don't decide what the meta is. We don't decide what items people use in any direct way. That's all somewhat indirect. We can add something to the game at a high rarity. It isn't used because it's difficult to obtain and becomes expensive, or something that we throw out there that's relatively easy, like a support gem that you can get from a vendor, happens to be critical for a build and changes things. And we want the values of the items, and hence the time it takes to acquire them, to be dictated by the market. We think that way there's really interesting natural swings where something becomes meta and all the prices shift. A player can invest in an item and then find a build and publicize it, and then the item becomes worth a lot of exalts, for example. We don't want to meddle with this kind of thing. We think that's smart gameplay. So fundamentally, we do feel the pain if it is true that you have to jump from a 10 chaos to a 10 exalt upgrade. I mean, personally, in my experience looking at how people are trading, there are often other improvements they can make to their character that don't have such a big ratio of jump there. But we typically see this as a very good thing for Path of Exile, that the economy is functioning well here, and the waxes and wanes of popularity of builds actually dictate the items and hence change the course of what people should be playing. Like sometimes, as you're saying, you want to play on meta because there's a glut of items that are near perfect but not quite there or whatever that people have crafted and deemed as fails. But on the other hand, it might be dumb to play a meta build where it causes things to be expensive, right? Like if you're competing with half the economy to play the easy build right now, then it's probably going to come at a cost with those items being expensive. So we don't want to tell players what to play, and we don't want to try to see what they're playing and then fix stuff up so it's easy for those people. We think that that's playing catch up, and it's better for us to focus on working on the next cool set of stuff. And we do plan things to make other builds easier and more accessible. When we're working on our next expansion, we say, what builds do we want to buff? Like, I don't know, maybe it's minion characters, or maybe it's melee or something like that. We'll just say, here's some stuff for those people to make it interesting because they haven't had any new toys in a while. And then that's going to cause the various ways those builds are created to change. The items will change value, the acquisition strategies will change value, and ideally it's a different experience every league.
I think that I can go on this topic for hours upon hours. I think I'll just rephrase a question about it, unless you guys have anything to chime in on as well.
Definitely have something, if that's okay, guys.
Yeah, you go ahead first.
It's following up. I just wanted to kind of chime in on what I think primarily the core of the crafting issue is. So on the high end, I think things are pretty much fine. If you've got the exalts, you can pretty much make the exact item you want. You've never been more powerful with the exception of Harvest. You can make pretty much pseudo mirror tier everything, with some exceptions. I think the real problem is on the lower end of things. If you're your average player, whatever that means, just someone who's chilling out in red maps, how are you going to engage with the crafting system? So for me at least, crafting is one of the funnest things you can do in the game. And right now, a lot of players just default to purchasing items off Path of Exile trade, which I think is a damn shame. So can you explain perhaps what your opinion is on the buy the item versus make it yourself kind of balance is right now? Because in my opinion, it's quite out of whack. and it's an accessibility problem and not necessarily a determinism problem or anything like that.
So I buy shoes rather than making my own ones in real life. It's entirely possible to get a pile of leather and spend the days it takes to learn how to make some kind of shoes that aren't going to be as good as the ones from the shop. Economies of scale dictate that a player who knows how to craft will be able to do a more efficient, both time and resource-wise job at making these items than a player who doesn't know how to craft. Now, I'm not saying I don't want players to know how to craft. Of course, it's better for everyone to get better skills at playing the game, and crafting is one of them. To actually answer your question in a non-facetious way, because I see chat is spamming with Cris stop, which is great. In a non-facetious way, I think that we can increase the education of how crafting works, right? Like, I do feel that we can help. And there are things we're discussing here, like having the ability in-game to actually dissect an item's mods on it and understand this is the range on this mod, these are the other ones available at different tiers. This is a suffix, and it could be any one of these things. The ability to kind of explore by clicking around an item and almost playing with the properties to see what kind of stuff you could get in the context of a specific craft. Like, I want to apply a Chaos Orb, what would that do? I want to apply an Essence, how could that work? What is available? That kind of thing, which is sometimes done by calculators on websites, could be useful in the game. This isn't a feature promise, of course. This is not something we've started at this stage, but I feel that some degree of tooling inside the game to help with crafting so that a person who's willing to learn it can experiment and understand the relatively complicated stuff going on there would help. And that means that in the context of crafting systems, like we're doing a little bit of this with ROG, for example, where it says I'm going to remove blah, blah, blah mod. So we highlight which ones it could be that's potentially removed. And as we gradually increase the tooling and education here, more players will learn how to make their own shoes, and that's only a good thing.
I have a few things that I kind of take a little bit of issue with. So you're talking about the example of making your own shoes. Well, I agree, but you've also, on the other side of the coin, said that SSF is your preferred mode of play. And the reason for that is that you have to do everything yourself. So wouldn't it be better to empower the player to be able to do the stuff themselves and not need to lean on trade and then actually capitalize on that vision you have for the ideal SSF behavior and have players actually do that in the trade economy?
Yeah, SSF is the desert island where there's no guy who makes shoes and you want to protect your feet, so you've got to put something together yourself, and it's kind of crap, but you have a good time.
And I want to make the shoes. I want to make them, Cris. Can't we all make our own shoes? But we just don't have the means to do so.
Claro, no tenemos las herramientas para hacer los zapatos.
Be able to more easily learn how to craft stuff, right? Like, I don't want it so that it's actually the situation where you physically can't make items. I would love it for every Path of Exile character to work out how to make stuff for themselves, and it's relatively obtuse at the moment. It's complicated. It's almost want to use the word archaic, and this is good, right? It's I like the fact that it's quirky and requires a lot of skill to make perfect stuff. Otherwise, literally everyone would be doing it. But I want to make sure that there are the tools available so anyone who wants to put their mind to it can do so.
Es que eso se llama Harvest.
The final thing I'll say,
dale a cualquier herramientas para craftear, se llama Harvest.
This is just feedback as a player, is that you can go up and craft an item, and it's either 0 or 100. It's either done or it's not. Every single currency in the game, with some exceptions, reforges the item completely. Is there any kind of thought about maybe having some form of, you know, I can upgrade this item instead of I scramble
Dices que cualquier tipo de ítem es o te hago el ítem o no te lo hago. No te roleo una parte, te lo roleo entero.
And an item, I think, would be a long way.
He preguntado, ¿hay alguna posibilidad de algún objeto que te actualice el objeto, que te lo mejore un poquito?
Mastercrafting, for example, is only a strict benefit that you can put on there, and there are other axes you can improve items on, right? It is just tricky because having it so that you have the expectation of starting with this item and guaranteedly getting to a better version, which you can get in cases of like Faded Uniques, various other bits and pieces, is just really dangerous.
Es muy peligroso hacer lo que
takes
estás
away
pidiendo.
the timing of the upgrades that we were talking before. We feel that having random processes here is significantly better for the game. Fundamentally, with the way the Path of Exile is designed.
Resumen del podcast. Lo acaba de decir. Nosotros creemos que el randomizar los ítems es mucho mejor para el juego.
There's still plenty of determinism in there, and we want to make sure there is loss. Like, we're not saying no to determinism. This doesn't have to be black or white. It's just that it's going to be 70% random, 30%
No tiene que ser blanco y negro tampoco.
People are okay with that, but we just need everyone to have the same amount of determinism. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, no, I feel that as well. I have two questions, though. You say that there are tools to upgrading your items. I just hope you're not referring to like slamming it with an Exalted Orb. Would you mind elaborating on what tools we have access for a lower end crafting, or someone is hitting a brick wall and they want to upgrade their character? What tools do they have to upgrade their gear?
¡Boom! Ten huevos,
if they're in a trade league, they should look for bargain items, right? There are a lot. It's what
But that wasn't.
This is.
Sorry to interrupt. That wasn't the question. The question is, what tools do they have to upgrade?
La pregunta es, ¿qué ítems tenemos para upgradear un ítem?
What access do they have? What tools do they have to upgrade their
¿Qué herramientas tenemos para mejorar un ítem?
The way that a player needs to approach crafting as they play through the game is that they are wearing an item and that they are working on the next item that they're going to put in that slot. They cannot assume that they're going to take one item and be able to upgrade that significantly far. There will, of course, be improvements that you can make, right? Like, if you have a good blue item that you've rolled, you can regal it, potentially. You can exalt an item. Practically speaking, these are things people do in SSF because you're not going to waste regals or waste exalts in trade leagues, obviously, right? Like, I understand that because of the perceived value of the currency in a trade league, it's insanity for me to say that exalts are a way for someone to upgrade their items. But you can say, I'm going to need better boots or gloves soon. I'm going to start making sure I've got the access to the essence, for example, that I need. I'm going to look for base types. I'm going to make sure I can quality them up. I'm going to make sure I've got the sockets sorted out. Make sure I've unlocked the relevant mastercrafts. There are a lot of systems there that aren't necessarily apparent to a person having their first playthrough of the game, but philosophically, you should always be working on your next item. Now, we even encourage this implicitly with the base types. As you play through the game, the base type you're using gets outdated. Obviously not a thing in endgame, but as you said, endgame already has progression there. Implicitly, you'll always have to be planning your next item anyway, and so that's how we prefer that people are upgrading their items.
Siempre vas a estar trabajando en tu siguiente ítem, por eso tiene el hueco ese, la pestaña de currency en medio, para que si quieres una mejor bota lo metas ahí y poco a poco le vas haciendo cosas.
But you should always be planning for the future.
Okay, so new items.
Yeah. May I add something in regards to that?
Well, that makes sense.
Currently,
sorry, go ahead.
Currently we're in a situation where there's sort of this huge opportunity cost of crafting items for yourself, and the prices on the market, especially relating to trade league, of materials and things like that, are dictated by people who do not craft for themselves. And me as a player who often, I love to SSF in trade leagues, so like make things for myself and things like that. But the opportunity cost of me making something for myself is like it's not realistic for me to actually create something for myself that's relatively cost efficient to just buying an item that someone lucked out on with mass craft. So what I'd like to call like a scrapyard of items. You just throw a bunch of dense fossils and then you throw everything in dump tabs, and what sells, what doesn't you recraft sort of situation. So we have such a market that is dictated by people who do this kind of crafting that it becomes almost inevitable that you should not craft for yourself.
El mercado está lleno de gente que hace metacraft de cosas que tú no puedes hacer por ti mismo, con lo cual si quieres acceder al ítem tienes que comprarlo, porque no lo sabes fabricar, ni tienes las herramientas.
A little bit of scarcity in regard to the materials that we can get if we'd like to craft for ourselves. So if I want to farm essences, it'll take me like a couple of weeks to be able to achieve the amount of essences that I need to craft something that I'm looking towards. So, fossil sources.
Si quiero farmear esencias para realísticamente usarlas para hacer un objeto, y 2 semanas.
Claro, y si quiero hacer lo mismo con fósiles, lo mismo y lo mismo y lo mismo.
And sure, I don't think this is a great player experience, right? Like, you're sitting there saying, I'm a bit dissatisfied by this, it's affecting my enjoyment of the game, and so therefore we want to solve it. Like, it's a very good problem to identify. It's just tricky because we are fighting against the core economic concepts of opportunity cost, supply and demand, economies of scale and so on, where it is probably going to be better that someone who's doing stuff in an efficient mass way makes the things and then other people buy them. It's kind of how our society works, unfortunately. And I would like there to be more SSF-style options in the game. We'll do whatever we can to try to provide those opportunities, but increasing for example, the availability of crafting materials so that it's easier for you also increases the availability and costing of crafting materials for the other people that are doing it really efficiently, and that's going to further lower the price. So you'll say to me, Cris, congratulations, you've made it so it's twice as easy for me to make this item for myself. I appreciate that. I now have an easier time making the item. But unfortunately, the cost of the items on trade has dropped by like 3 times, so I'm totally going to buy a bunch of those instead. It's just so much more efficient now. And that's the tricky part about this.
Vale, si hace más fácil los sistemas de crafteo, la gente que sabe cómo usarlos eficientemente va a poder hacerlos masivamente y por tanto el precio del ítem va a caer en picado 2-3 veces, con lo cual si te hace fácil,
mejor, claro, en términos de opportunity cost, va a seguir siendo mejor comprarlo que gastarte el dinero en
hacerlo.
A solution to this that some games do is to take trading away, and I'm not saying like, Sefer or anything, but to take trading away fundamentally to game level and then making this perfect experience for each player.
Claro.
Where this is how
Lo que hacen otros juegos es te quito la posibilidad de tradear.
Control it because it's just on a person by person basis, and that's a different type of game. Which you'll have a great experience upgrading your items, but there's no real sense of value because everyone else is on the same kind of pseudo theme park treadmill with their item progression. And so here we have this beautiful thing where you can absolutely become the efficient guy at doing dense fossil spamming or whatever and make a bunch of currency from it. It's kind of the dream that right now Path of Exile being like a perfect capitalist whatever means that you can just suddenly become rich in a league by having a really cool idea or doing something more efficiently than other players.
And does this kind of explain why you guys made Harvest untradeable and Ashlings a bench and all sorts of stuff like this to kind of try and incentivize players to use it themselves and not just trade
Meanwhile,
it
Queen 69 con 14.000 espectadores jugando un juego de móvil.
Then that is an attempt to do that, yes. Like, and here's an example.
Y el podcast con 11.000.
Let's spoil some content from the future.
Vale, este es el resumen de la liga. 14.000 espectadores juego de móvil, 11.000 podcasts con un creador del juego.
The splinters will not be tradable, and they will be auto pickup, right? And this is because, as far as we're concerned, a tradable object you should have to pick up yourself, and something that's non-tradable is just a score, like Azerite or whatever, and it gets scooped up because you can do that because it's not a real thing. It's just a score at that stage. So why are we making them non-tradable? Why are we making it so that it's just a score of how many splinters you've got for the various different vendors? And the answer is because we actually want people to do those things themselves. Because right now, and I was literally completely persuaded into this on a podcast. Like, you can almost see my face at the moment that this was mentioned to me, and I realized how correct it was. That right now, even if we had 20 different types of currency to encourage people to specialize in, using certain vendors, because of the tradability, if you're not very good at using Gwenin, you will just trade the currency away to someone who is efficient at it. And we want everyone to be gambling. And
si tú no gambleas con Gwenin, le vendes la currencia a otro que sepa gamblear con Gwenin.
So that players do get a chance
Pero no, es que está diseñado para que el jugador lo experimente. No queremos que trades con la currencia de expedición.
And a certain allocation of rogue crafts. And to some extent, it prevents the economy getting in the way of this. If Gwenin is a perfect way of getting unique items, which would be nice for there to be some degree of, not determinism, but easier access there, then by allocating it to each player in particular and preventing it being tradable, that does prevent the issue where the market is just totally glutted with unique items. It means that you can individually enjoy using her as a tool, rather than saying, I don't understand how to gamble efficiently, I'm going to let someone else do it. And ditto for rug crafting and so on. So this is a case of us trying to block tradability of part of the process in an attempt to spread out the ability to make shoes to more players.
Hostias. Te bloqueamos parte del tradeo para forzarte a que experimentes el juego como lo hemos diseñado.
It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I had one follow-up question on everything we talked about with items before we move on. And that was the whole solution to people hitting the brick wall. And what I was thinking there is that we talk about there being a problem with itemization, you dropping your upgrades, and then we have the problem with that there literally is no feasible way for a low investment or early stage progression on a character to actually craft their own
El ejemplo que
items.
os es Expedition porque quiere que no vendamos aquello que no sabemos hacer, sino que lo intentemos.
Pero molaría que fueran los sprinters en general.
Where you want to be, right? So it's like in that situation, I'd say that's a problem, and I think that the majority of the community would say that that is a problem, that they either have to purchase it, and then the other problem with non-meta builds, cost of those items comes into play. So the solutions, to me, the way I can see it, is to either look into more deterministic crafting for the lower end, or fixing the itemizations, or hell, why not both? So in that sense, what's the idea? What's the progression from GGG's point of view with what steps you guys want to take into solving this very big problem that the community has right now?
We don't have an answer for what we're changing to do with itemization, because our current step we're doing is to finish developing hard mode and get that out there and start getting feedback on that, right? There will be things in hard mode of certain things turned off when we get to see how the economy works without them. Like our current draft of it has no master crafting. Now, ironically, master crafting is part of the answer to your question of how a mid-level player gets some kind of ability to polish.
No, una polla, mid-level player no va a hacer master crafting.
It's
que no, y tú no le metes resistencia para acabar otro
objeto. Pero es que eso no es master crafting.
Esto es master crafting, la mesa es master crafting.
No lo veo así.
So I'd like to come on the podcast and say to you,
Metacraft es lo que tú estás pensando, pero mastercraft es la mesa.
Which is we're able to do about some of the systems we're changing.
Que es lo que antes hacías, antes de Betrayal, mastercraft.
Vale.
We could talk about items all day, Cris.
Yeah.
Puto.
I'd like to ask one quick final thing to end on the items. What do you feel about metacrafting? Because it always ends up, an item always finishes metamods.
¿Qué opinas de
It's always
metacraft?
the case of you do the suffixes or you do the prefixes, and then you metamod to exalts, you roll the dice, right? And Harvest is the only thing that actually respects metamods in this case, or beastcraft, right? So we're sort of stuck in the system where we have to utilize.
Lleva rato sin decir diablos, se os está pasando la cogorza.
Right? And we're always gonna have to go back to the metamodding and finishing one item. So it sort of restricts the items we can make in this regard, but it also pigeonholes us into one way of crafting. Is this intended, or is this something that you'd like to look?
We recently have been looking at the progression of crafting systems in Path of Exile, where we did a thing where we looked at what was added bit by bit by bit by bit as we went through time. And Eternal Orbs were a mistake, and I feel that Metamods were a mistake. They were the point where things started to get very out of hand, and there were strategies that were dominant for certain types of finishing certain types of items and not for others. Metamods have combined with tons of other systems to be really dangerous. Having said that, this isn't something this isn't a subtle announcement that we're removing metacrafting from the game, right? Like, it's got its purpose, it makes a lot of items, it helps solve problems that you guys are having. It's just that when we're actually looking through, we realize if we'd have done something different there, it probably would have been better for the long-term health of the item system. That was the first step down the slippery slope of determinism that's led to part of the problem we have at the moment. So I can almost guarantee that there will be no metacrafting in hard mode, because, for a start, there's no master crafting at the moment, but when it comes back, it'll be more remedial and less metamoddy. Now, in the main game, yeah, as I said, not an announcement that we're turning it off. It's just an acknowledgement that we kind of frown at that a bit and want ideally to find a better system. I don't know whether we'll still have metacrafting in Path of Exile in 2 years. Hopefully we'll have found some way to do it that players like more, that has fewer problems and still lets them make compelling items. But yeah, it's certainly a good thing to point out that we're worried about.
Hopefully something that isn't so expensive.
No les gusta, pero no lo pueden cambiar, básicamente. Hasta que tengan algo mejor.
Be something more achievable for more players than just the top end, that would be great. Because right now, if changing that would definitely make the higher end harder to achieve, which I think is a good approach. If you lower the higher end and make sure, in terms of deterministic approaches when it comes to crafting, and increase the deterministic approaches for the lower end. Basically, I just see a big ladder. At the top, you have tons of currency, almost guaranteed deterministic crafts are possible for most items. In some cases, you have 100% deterministic, and at the end, it's just RNG. Just flip it upside down, and everyone would be happy. For the most part, that's extreme.
Oh man. Okay, so I know we're leaving a lot on the table here. I'm sure all three of us could talk for another hour about items, but in the reason of time, we're gonna have to move on. Next topic, the next heading here is going to be endgame and aspirational content. So you mentioned that you're shortening the Atlas grind in 3.16.
Por el amor de
and in
Cris,
past podcast, you mentioned that you'll develop 3.17 with player feedback in mind. So can you talk a little bit about what the key takeaways from having 2 years of the Conqueror's Atlas are, and maybe a little bit of spice about things that you might kind of learn from and not do in 3.17, or do?
Right. So we've said we're going to develop the new endgame with player feedback in mind. But one thing to bear in mind is, if we took every single piece of player feedback into account, because they often contradict each other, people want different things. Some person says, I like this, another person says, I don't like this. If we took every single piece of feedback into mind, we'd probably have no game, right? We have to, at some point, agree, we have to go through the player feedback and say, this person is right. This person is aligned with what we're trying to get out of Path of Exile. If a person said they want to type some item stats into a box and receive that item, we'd ignore that feedback because it's not how we want the game to work. And so for in-game player feedback, the process of going through player feedback to work out which ones we agree with is the process of designing the end game. Right. And so for 3.17, there are 2 reasons why I can't tell you too much about the end game now. The first one is that is something, despite the fact that we want to be really transparent with communication and come on the podcast and talk about changes we're making, the way the end game works is probably going to be saved for the announcement. That's one we have to sort out without community feedback, because we've heard a lot of feedback and we want it to be a surprise and we want it to be compelling and awesome. So the 3.17, here is how the new end game works. It's going to happen probably on a live stream announcement thing. I'll be wearing fancier clothes. You get the idea. It might even be in my office. It will be more of a big announcement because we'll be quite confident in that system at that stage. The other reason is this is a process that we're going through at the moment, trying to work out how the end game works, and we're being really careful to consider a lot of options, right? Like, we know this is the most important thing for us to design. Screwing up the end game here will kill Path of Exile. There is a lot of pressure on this. We're taking our time to do it well, and we're confident, right? There's a lot of good ideas we've had in the past, not spoiling any now, that we're quite keen to do, both from, you know, compelling and interesting boss fights and enemies, and ways of progressing in the end game. There are bits and pieces coming in 3.16 that we've already talked about, and a few more that we haven't talked about, which will help endgame progression quite a lot in the meantime and kind of signify the direction that we're going. And we're fully aware of the feedback that right now, like, here's an example of something. Right now, we know that the Atlas passive stuff is very top-heavy. This is something that players feel they have to completely finish that system before they can actually have fun grinding with their characters. And that's something we want to make sure is paced a whole lot differently and a whole lot better in the future. Other feedback that we've taken into account is we want to make sure the system is good for multiplayer. We want to make sure that if a party is playing through, they get the ability to all progress rather than getting stuck on certain progress. We also feel that the current Watchstone system is really confusing and complex. Like, to be 100% honest, I don't understand it as well as I should. Like, it's a mark of shame that I walk into the office at work not fully understanding how our endgame works. Thankfully, I'm not the designer primarily working on that, but it's a problem, right? Like, and how many other players are struggling with it? Yeah, so that's pretty much all I can say at the moment about the new endgame stuff, but we spend all day discussing this, and it's going to be good.
I have a few short bullet points, but I'll give the other two an opportunity
to
talk about Atlas stuff.
Empezarán a meter cosas en la 3.16.
I just feel like the way they're going with the
Pero
change of the
lo gordo
pacing
está la
to the Atlas, I
3.17.
think that's perfect, and the only way I can verify if I'm happy with it or not is to play it when it's released. I don't really have anything else to add to it. I think that the vision of moving forward is going to be an interesting take, and I hope it's going to be as good as I hope it will be.
¿Estás viendo el stream?
Yeah. I second that. Yeah, I definitely agree with the fact that, like, there's sort of a lot of complexity with the Watchstone system.
El mío.
I feel like it's not completely necessary in that regard, because as a new player,
I
remember the first time I played through that system, just getting stuck and being like, I don't understand what's going on. But once we've developed, obviously, the meta that is now...
Son putos gemelos, lo miréis como lo miréis.
I understand, but someone that doesn't have access to that information, I can guarantee they'll have a heck of a hard time.
Cara de me quitan el crafteo.
Yeah. I definitely look forward to seeing sort of your solution to this issue,
Yeah. All right, I'm going to tackle it head on then. So we talked about this off stream, Cris, but I think the community needs to hear it because I needed to hear it. So a number of players really enjoy running one map, their favorite map. And I'm going to compare this to running Baal or Mephisto from your D2 heydays. Are we going to see this in the future? And if not, why not?
We have the favored map system that allows you to bias towards specific content, and that combined with the ability to trade do let people specialize in doing a specific thing, like one specific type of map, a layout that they like, or potentially something like Delve or Heist or Expedition. The ability to both bias the system towards giving you certain results and the ability to trade for the other ones means that you can focus on that. And we think that's roughly in a good place there. We do like the ideas that players can focus on a specific type of map, but we do not want it to be too easy to 100% do that. It's very typical for, and we found this data in the past, that a player who has the ability to play exactly the same layout repeatedly will do that and then not play the game for as long as someone that plays a variety of different maps. There's a reason why Path of Exile has random generation and so on. And we're kind of left feeling that the feedback is that players say that they want to play their favorite map repeatedly, and they'll say, it's my favorite map, I love this one, I have the most fun there, and as though that's a positive thing, but the favorite map they're talking about is a straight line, right? Like, the feedback we kind of get is that players want to play repeatedly a map that is a straight line, they want to be able to kill monsters without stopping, and they want the items to be auto-picked up, and to some extent I feel that if we email them a spreadsheet every day of what items they got, they'd be happy. Like, it kind of feels that people don't want to have to challenge themselves to fight different bosses or be able to cope with different situations. And so we don't want to go all in on that. But yeah, you'll be able to specialize to some extent, right? Like, we do like the fact that you can say, I kind of prefer these layouts, I want them more often, but it's going to require trade in order to be able to, like, 100% something like that.
Can I add something to that in regards to, like, what favorite map? Because I do understand that some people do, you know, all they want to do is run Strand. But with the way that the Atlas works now is you're certain mechanics tend to favor certain layouts, right? So if you want to do Legion, you want an open layout. If you want to do Blight, you'd rather have a closed layout so you can condense the lanes into fewer lanes and get hopefully the better rewards, right? So in regards to what favorite map means, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the fastest one to run, but it's, let's say, the map where you prefer to get your league mechanic, which might change depending on the zone that you're running, right? So having that be restricted through sort of RNG or the trade system, I feel like feels like a little bit, restricted.
We like the concept of overlapping axes of randomness, the idea that certain league mechanics are going to be good or bad when you encounter them based on a variety of factors, how lucky you get, how many chests, how many lanes, whatever. And one of those is what map layout you have, and the ability to say smartly, and this is the smart thing you're discussing of, I like the idea of, say, condensing the blight encounters down to be, much more manageable. That's a good thing for players to have some degree of control over. There wouldn't really be a system there if you could just flick a switch and have it always be on that map, of course. We have to have a compromise where you can bias towards better outcomes, but don't guarantee best outcomes.
A little bit of a follow-up from me. So just for you, Cris. So a lot of players still obviously long for that play style, and they endure the trade. They will trade for their favorite map. I'm one of them, and I'm sure you've got another one here on Crouch and Tuna as well. Now, the problem that has is that those players get increasingly frustrated with buying those maps, and then they go on Reddit and they say that trade sucks. When the real problem is that they can't acquire the items for themselves. And multiple times throughout this podcast, you've already said that it goes back to trade. It goes back to trade. If you can't get the item you want, trade for it. Can't get the maps that you want to sustain because the system's been changed, so you can't do so. Trade for it. And then you get into stuff like scarabs, delirium mobs, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But all of these things just all lead back and all put this pressure on the trade system, which has people very, very mad right now. So I guess if you kind of like remedy a few of these things, do you not think that maybe the pressure might come off a little bit if you eased it?
Yeah, this is feedback we've been looking at for 317's endgame. It actually prompted a question about... So the thing we have at the moment is when a player runs a map, they want to control which map it is, and they want to juice the hell out of it using scarabs and various other stuff. And this implies a few things. Like, obviously there's this case of, they want the best return, but it also implies that the game content isn't interesting enough unless it's been juiced, right? Like a baseline map that's not juiced just doesn't have enough stuff for the players in it. And so what we're thinking with 317 potentially is to raise the default juicedness of stuff so that the scarabs and so on become much more of a luxury, so you just don't need to trade for them as often, right? It's one of those things where slapping a scarab on, rather than being an expectation, it becomes a treat, and that way you just need far fewer. The numbers are all different, so you're getting a lot of that juiceness by default. And so that's the direction we're thinking of going here, so that there's less need to... If trade is a requirement to play a map, it would be nice if trade was just an occasional thing you could do for an even better map experience.
Ha hecho básicamente, a la 3.17 vamos a intentar que los mapas de base ya tengan un montón de las cosas que tú le metes para que no tengas que meterse.
Claro, pero eso es dentro de 6 meses.
It's really straightforward. Is the idea of balancing the game, because the majority of the player base plays softcore trade, we know that, and it feels a lot like some changes feels like they are targeted with the idea of having the aspect or the possibility to trade is a tool that is supposed to be a solution for these type of players, and it feels like that's the point you're going back to. So my question is that the idea, or would you rather have people actually find their upgrades and whatnot, because relying on the trade makes huge problematic obstacles that occurs when you're, for example, playing a non-meta build and whatnot?
You guys are the softcore trade players. I've spoken to the hardcore/SSF players in other podcasts, so my intention here is to talk about a league where trade is possible, right? To some extent, if someone's watching this and they say, but I can't do this in solo self-found, you might be watching the wrong podcast. Our goal here is to talk about a league with trade in it, and so trade will definitely be a tool in that league. Now, I think people have to trade too much, but it's also... Trade is going to be the best choice in some cases because of the whole you're bad at making your own shoes problem, right? Like there are cases on trade where the opportunity cost of not trading is too high. And so we do have to bear in mind that trade is going to be a thing players are doing regardless of what tools we give them. It'll give the people that are trading with the same tools who will use them more efficiently, as we discussed earlier. Anyway, long story short, yes, I completely agree that you having to dip into trade, which is intentionally a frustrating experience for every map you play, is not a good place, right? Like We've even discussed like de-itemizing some of the stuff that you're juicing maps with to prevent that stuff being traded. So you can still trade for plenty of stuff to juice maps, but a lot of the core stuff might be de-itemized so that you get a more controlled allocation of it, and you can specialize where you want to put it and so on. There's a lot of topics there. This is not firm.
Like, none of this will happen.
It's entirely the direction we're going to, with our current line of thinking to see how we can improve the end game, taking your feedback into account.
This is really good. I liked what you're saying, Cris. Yeah. Just to dig a little bit deeper and bring up another big problem. So you've talked about rotating leagues out in the future, but I want to understand if you're happy with the sheer amount of different league mechanics presented to players in maps, especially new players. So you can walk into a map and get like 8 new league mechanics with 5 different UIs and meta progression. Is there any thought about maybe giving the player a little bit more agency over which lead mechanics they encounter, maybe to counteract this scarab problem? Because if I could just run what I wanted.
Dice, estás hablando de que en el futuro se rotarán mecánicas, no las tenemos todas disponibles de golpe. Pero imagínate ser un jugador nuevo, llegar y encontrarte 5 mecánicas diferentes funcionando con un montón de ítems y un montón de cosas diferentes. ¿Hay alguna forma o tenéis algún plan para hacerlo más accesible para la gente nueva?
Currently, the way it works, we added this up, is you have approximately 1 league mechanic by default in every map area. As in, it's obviously, again, a normal distribution. There's like 12 different league mechanics with an 8% rate. Sometimes you're going to get 3, sometimes you're going to get 0, but you get some rate of league mechanics in your face.
El ratio es que te salga una mecánica por mapa.
Juice those further using either scarabs or the Atlas passives. And this means that by currently application of scarabs that you've got to trade for or earn, or specialization in the Atlas tree, que
claro, con la especialización del Atlas y los escarabajos puedes hacer que haya mucho más, pero de base una, en algunos 0, en otros 3. Dice, no sé cómo contestar esto sin hablar del hard mode.
We don't even know if we're having Atlas passives in the 317 endgame, but we do want to make sure that players have the ability to specialize in specific league mechanics that they like. Having said that, if it's just a matter of turning on that league mechanic, turning off all the other ones, and I'm just getting blight this entire league, that would be a bit lame. We do want it so the other stuff crops up occasionally, so you do have to face a diverse set of challenges. But yeah, there'll be some degree of specialization there.
That's fantastic to hear. That's great.
Yeah, I like that as well.
All right, next question. This is an interesting one. So in previous conversation, you mentioned that originally red maps were supposed to be very accessible to players. Very inaccessible to players.
Jugando en el mapa,
but now they're considered a standard requirement. Are you able to tell us about where you draw the line with which content should be fairly accessible and which content should be accessible to a small number? Because I imagine the end game's kind of gotten out of control. I don't know why that is, but maybe you can answer that.
So we want pinnacle fights to be accessible to good, experienced players. And so the question is, what does this mean? So there are 2 things that stop you from completing a pinnacle fight. There's power and there's knowledge. So as time passes, we add more power through power creep. Every expansion we release makes the numbers go bigger, gives you more tools, all of that kind of stuff. And players share more knowledge. And so by this I mean, let's say that in 317 we introduce some kind of pinnacle boss that's really difficult, right?
Claro.
So how do you do the fight?
En el 3.17 te vamos a meter
when people try it out, they die because they don't know.
Uber, combates. ¿Cómo lo vences? No puedes porque no tienes el combate necesario. No tienes los conocimientos.
Boss, this hypothetical one that's at the end of the game, it's hard to kill, it's complicated, you have to work for it. When the person gets the world first kill, that's going to be a good moment, and people are going to, it's the highlight of their league that they can kill that boss and get one of these exciting things that it has, this hypothetical boss that we haven't designed. The next league that comes out, players kind of know what to do. They've been fighting that thing occasionally in the previous one, so it's easier to get to, it's easier to complete, it takes less days, it's less exciting. And power-wise, well, we've just released a whole pile of new skills in like 318 or whatever, and so the boss is easier to fight. And so the line creeps down over time. When we release new content, it's both exciting and difficult from a knowledge and power point of view, blah, blah, blah. And only a top portion of players defeat it. So to answer your question about where the line is, the first time a boss or whatever comes out, only the people that can get the knowledge and power within that league are going to be able to defeat it. And to some extent that's okay. The other players understand. I just wasn't able to do it.
¿Dónde está la línea? La primera liga que sale un boss, solo aquellos que acumulen una gran cantidad de poder o de conocimiento podrán vencerlo. Y está bien.
There's an expectation. Everyone knows how to do it. They've got the tools
no todo es accesible para todos.
To be able to kill Cyrus 8 or the Maven really easily without any problems. And that's the point where we need to introduce new challenges. And so the lesson here is that we need to replace the endgame's aspirational content frequently.
Necesitamos reiniciar o refrescar el endgame con cierta frecuencia.
Like maybe there's some cool endgame heists or whatever, but it leaves the actual Atlas stuff alone. And I'm really tempted to pull up a graph of player retention, but needless to say, the leagues where we change the endgame are the ones that have the best player retention for obvious reasons. There's more challenges, there's more stuff to do in the endgame. And so this is leading us to consider that one of the things we should be doing with a new endgame is having it be modular enough that every release that we do, like every 3 months, we have the ability to tweak it or add some Uber version of something or whatever, so that there's new aspirational stuff for players to do at the end game. Like actually formally saying we're going to update this 4 times a year to a small extent rather than once a year, and not touch at the other leagues. So this is the line of thinking we have internally at the moment.
I really like that approach.
That sounds great.
Yeah,
Ha dicho, las mejores ligas son las que añaden cosas nuevas, porque la gente tiene más cosas y disfruta más.
So we touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to speak a little bit about friction, specifically on the
en el sentido de que cada 3 meses puedan meter cosas en el endgame, en el sentido de meter cosas en los Conquer o en Sirius, que haya cosas nuevas cada liga en el ala y no algo que pase una vez al año.
I mean, the intention was that if a person wants to waste a bunch of currency juicing the map to be literally impossible and then they somehow try to do it, then that's fine. Like, that's all working okay. We just didn't expect people to have it kind of on farm so much. And part of this is the expectation of, like, making an insane map and then using the fractured fossil stuff or whatever to duplicate it, and then that case that we classify somewhat as an abuse case that was done for a while set expectations that players want to be running maxed out content and getting good rewards. And if they're not finding 30 uniques per map or whatever, something's going wrong. And so we've had to kind of subvert those expectations to some extent. And I think it's going to cause some lasting damage to the game that some players, well, it's like 25 players, but some players have really had quite a lot of access to juiced content very cheaply for quite some time. And other people have watched that on stream. And in general, the expectations of what people are doing in the end game are not really where we feel are reasonable. Like, our goal is that if you max out a map, that it's actually insanely difficult and insanely rewarding, but it's something you don't get to do very often.
Parece que el problema no es que esté la opción de que haya top players que accedan a esa recompensa, sino que lo streamen.
I know this isn't a great answer to the question. It was intentional that people could juice their maps as much as they have done, but people were doing it to a much greater and more common degree than we intended.
Tienes que estar sea
right. So what you have to say to the player? Oh, go ahead, Tino.
I just wanted to add that I feel like most people that I've talked to as a gameplay loop, they're not looking for Delirium maps to be back, but they're looking for something to replace that as like aspirational content, and that's something we talked about before this. But essentially, that's where I feel like that direction needs to go, is for people to look forward to something where it's like, why am I playing the game? To why am I creating my character and this sort of stuff. And that was great content to go into.
Yeah, that definitely leads us quite well into the next question, actually. So building an extremely powerful character with perfect items is one of the most exciting things you can do in an action RPG. So right now, many players feel there is little reason to pursue these characters anymore with the removal of 5-orb, and, you know, for most purposes, Deep Delve's a lot less interesting. So can you talk through a few of your ideas for top-end content that demands an extremely powerful content that you might maybe be looking to implement in the future?
So we like the idea of difficult content that requires extremely powerful characters. Like, we love the idea of putting something out there that players just can't do, and they have to kind of solve it as a problem, right? How am I going to make a character that's strong enough to do that content? The problem here is perceived build diversity, right? Either we put this incredibly difficult content out there with the expectation that somehow all the builds in the game can do it, which is obviously crazy, or only a limited set of builds can do it, in which case there's going to be diversity issues. You can see this in Deep Delve, right? Like, there's an extremely set of limited viable builds. It's pretty much only the ones that can mitigate that much damage. And so, if you
wait. I have to stop you there. There's no mitigating damage in Deep Delve.
Mitigate, wrong word. Okay, be invulnerable to damage.
No.
No sabes cómo se juega Deep Delve.
Well,
take over the wheel, man.
Just don't take damage, and just corpse run if you do. Let's Delve in its current state. Unless we're talking about hardcore, of course, then it's a totally different, more interesting metagame, in my opinion.
Acaba de mostrar Cris que no tiene ni puta idea de las builds que se juegan en dónde se juegan.
Corpse rushing is...
Porque acaba de hablar de algo que se nerfeó hace 4 parches.
Okay, fair enough that I misunderstood how people are surviving in Delve. But there is a limited amount of build variety there, right? Like,
Agreed. 100%.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Chat says Chris here thinking deep delve is depth 50. There we go.
Just to summarize, the deep delve builds run around with chaos inoculation, about 50 life and 3 billion damage, and they just don't get hit and one shot everything. That's how they do it.
Claro, one-shotean todo y nada los toca.
Yeah. So philosophically, though, if we have something like deep delve, you're going to have builds that are relatively narrow. You don't get the ability to really engage with the content as much. I like the idea of having very, very, very difficult content for specific reasons. So then ideally you get different builds pigeonholed for each thing. I don't have any problem whatsoever with that. But we have to get over the build viability thing as a community if we're doing that. Like, if there are 5 different endgames for Path of Exile and each one has a build that can do that most efficiently, that's a game where there are 5 different endgame builds. And of course, there's incentive for players to find out new ones, but that's not necessarily what a lot of people have communicated they want recently. To some extent, if you have it so the hardest content is at a lower cap, there's lots of builds that can handle that content, and there's more variability, and it helps, affect the ability to trade for items and stuff. Now, one important thing to note about future content is that you're probably not going to have extreme aura and curse bots to carry you through it. People have been very clear that they want balance changes to aura bots. To the point where, in a previous podcast, I said, don't worry, we're only nerfing Fortify as far as main game systems go. And then everyone's like, but what about aura bots? Like, yes, we'll do that nerf as well because it's so requested. And this is going to affect the ability to play some of this deepest content in whatever form it is.
I do have a question.
I think that's a good change, personally.
You say that you're nerfing it because it's heavily requested. Does this mean that GDD finds aura bots in a good state right now, according to your philosophy, and the only reason you're nerfing it is because it's demanded by the community, or do you also agree with the community that they are in need of a heavy nerf?
I agree, but my main job is a producer, and that means making sure that we hit our deadlines and get stuff released on time and have enough content in there and meet our monetization goals and all of that kind of stuff. And we could make a list of 1,000 things we want to improve with Path of Exile, and if we did them all, we'd never get the next release out. And so when the community clamor that degree with Aurabots, we feel that we could not get away without a change. Like, if we did nothing for Aurabots in 3.16, the players would say, can you not read Reddit? You must fix Aurabots. And so that had to go on the list. And the only reason for us considering not doing it isn't balance reasons, but just because there's a lot of stuff to change in Path of Exile, and we have to pick a subset of it. In fact, one problem we've been running into internally recently, well, let's describe 2 problems.
Está hablando de los Aurabots y las builds que se juegan solo caminando.
3.15, and we feel we have to respond to that feedback and make sure that players feel that we're improving those parts of the game, right? Like, we really screwed up with a lot of 3.15 stuff, and that's not good, and we want to earn the trust back. We want to make a lot of changes. And so we've expanded 3.16 to include all of the stuff ranging from defenses through to the second flask rework and so on. And this is all good. It's going to help the game. We feel we're earning the trust back for the players. It's a good direction to be going. We've got aspirational content for the end game. There's a whole bunch of stuff in 3.16, which makes 3.16 kind of the largest expansion we've had to put together for a long time, to the point where we're looking, how are we going to get this done in time? It's a tricky one. And then New Zealand got its long COVID lockdown because we're like 18 months behind the rest of the world due to being on a small island. And so things aren't looking great from an internal production point of view at the moment, and there's a lot of pressure there. And that's why a decision to get Aurabots in is actually one we don't take lightly, like the ability to get the nerf in, because that requires us doing additional work in an already crammed expansion. Having said that, Aurabots trivialize the progression of players who are not using them, and therefore we do not want to have that as part of the game, so we will fix
no queremos que los Aurabots sean parte del juego porque trivializan en la evolución del personaje. Porque no evoluciona el personaje, evoluciona que tengas un tío al lado.
I have a billion different Aurabots probably screaming at me in my ears here. So by fix, do you mean delete or do you mean rework? Is it still going to be possible to play that sort of style
o lo vas a reworkear?
Or is it just going to be destroyed?
Lo vas a destruir.
There's a lot of things being discussed. I think that's a good question, and we do want to communicate it before randomly surprising people in the patch notes. So that's one of the balance things that we'll probably be talking about. Support characters are implicitly fine. It's just a question of to what extent they're supporting the party. If you're running around doing damage alongside your friend, then you're taking 50% of the load each.
Que haya support está bien, pero hasta qué punto
5 or 6,
se permite.
5 other people to a huge degree, that's potentially too good. Now, there are some very interesting things being discussed internally, like new support skills and that kind of stuff. I don't know if we're actually
nuevas habilidades de soporte
finished in time. I'm hoping we will.
De utilidad.
We'll talk about it once we've got a complete plan.
One quick
Y lo hablaremos
question
más
I
adelante
wanna
cuando lo
ask in
tenga un
that
poco
regard
más desarrollado.
do you ever plan to maybe having... You just sort of mentioned that just a little bit, but having supports not be just something that follows you around that gives you 500% more damage, but rather, I hate to bring this game up, but, you know, for example, in Diablo, like, you have a barbarian that goes around and gathers everything together so then you can nuke it through, like, you know, like, things like that.
Está preguntando, ¿y algún otro tipo de soportes como el bárbaro del diablo que se trata de pulear, otro que se trata de que no sea solo un más 500 al daño? Dice que sí, que el 3.16 próximo parche nos trae nuevas mecánicas de soporte más interesantes.
Y aparte ha dicho más aspirational content para el endgame, como lo que dijeron de Uber Blight y Uber...
Parece que viene a haber muchos más support. No es de support, pero va a haber más support.
Él ha dicho que el 3.16 es el parche pequeño más grande que hay, teniendo en cuenta que hicieron delirio.
Endgame content and your plans for it, and you had a few issues that you brought up. I think Tino can address that with his next question and maybe tackle that, Tino.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask whether in Path of Exile there's a place for a system, let's say similar to Wilds Mythic Plus, something that exists outside of maps that has almost no friction to access, but it rewards building a well-rounded character and requires you to like overcome content rather than just speedrun through it or something like that. So that would ideally be tied to a leaderboard, while the rewards would be, I don't know, would be good. It would not be the primary motivation. I feel like players, a lot of fun is derived from, you know, competing with each other, maybe on leaderboards, through arbitrary
leaderboards, algún tipo de competición entre jugadores, algún otro objetivo de endgame.
I feel like when I heard about simulacrums, I felt like this was the sort of content, but it ended up being something that almost anyone could compete to the end wave. But yeah, that pretty much
alguien o una competición simulacro a ver quién llega a una oleada más arriba.
Plus, how does the endless scaling, like, is there an endless scaling part of it? How does that work?
You just can't get past a certain point, unless then you get more gear later on, which is, you know, introduced through a new raid tier thing. But essentially, there's a soft cap, and nobody can get past.
Right, I see. Okay, so
I think it's critical to highlight that WoW's Mythic Plus kind of caps out around the 15 to 20 range in terms of its tiers. Some people go higher, but when you compare that and contrast that to a system like Delve, which has 6,000 depths, you know, it needs to be much more acquirable for a lower amount of time. It should reward skill and not time investment to, you know, disincentivize bots and 24-hour play sessions and stuff like that. Yeah, I think there's a lot that we could talk about there. We're totally open to you know, having some sort of community forum if you're interested in more feedback on that.
Well, one note with Delve is we're discussing having rebalancing it so that you only need to go to shallower depths to get the same level of difficulty. You know, from a respecting players' time point of view, not having to go down to 6,000 to get the 6,000 depth content. So that's a bit of an ongoing thing internally. Not that answers your question at all. It's just a side note. With your description of this mode you're talking about, you mentioned existing outside of maps. So what do you mean by that? Do you mean you don't have to use a map to get into it, or?
So the idea is that incredibly difficult content currently exists in the form of 5-orb delirium with maximum juice, right? But many of the players who are doing that no longer see that as viable, and the reason for that is friction. You need to, you know, engage in the trade system and buy, you know, tons of rare items, and a lot of them are really scarce, and that's not a fun experience. So the idea would be that, you know, you get the same experience, the same difficulty in an alternative setting, which only requires, you know, buying maybe like one item, similar to the Fractured Fossil. And you can kind of challenge your character, you know, do content and really have a really fun gameplay experience without spending, you know, 60% of your time trading for materials.
Right. So having it so that there's a endgame challenge that you do have an economic cost for, like you have to trade for or acquire or whatever, that actually involves sacrificing an item is entirely fine with us. If it was a thing you can just sign up for that's free, then you get the Maelstrom of Chaos problem from Path of Exile's old endgame, where players could literally enter the hardest area of it at a whim and then die and then complain about the game being too hard, when if you have to sacrifice something to gain entry, like, you know, higher maps are more expensive, for example, then you always make sure to take into account whether or not you can complete the content before you engage in it. Mm-hmm. So having it so that you do have to consume a thing to get into this hypothetical mode is good, right? Like I'm totally fine with that part of it. when you say existing outside of maps, you just mean doesn't require trading for a whole bunch of different components in order to put it together. I assume you'd be okay with it still using the map system's random tile sets, random monsters, random league content, and so on?
Correct.
One issue with the random tile set, especially when it ties into challenge content and leaderboards, I feel like it's something that was introduced in Diablo 3 where people fish for a layout. And I think that is inherently sort of an issue that has presented itself in that scenario. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. But if you're timing someone or whatever you're doing, then if the person who gets the best layout that's most appropriate for it will do best on the leaderboard. So if you're doing leaderboards, you'd want to have a leaderboard per layout maybe or something like that, and then people can special. Yep, fair enough. Okay, so you described in the question having like a well-rounded character that requires you to overcome content instead of speedrun it. Or at least that's the written copy of the question has that phrasing. So how do you stop players optimizing for efficiency here? Like in terms of don't speedrun the content, but actually overcome it. Obviously players are going to be incentivized, especially if there's a leaderboard, to do something efficiently, even if it's from their personal time point of view. So what's the difference between overcoming content versus speedrunning it? Do you mean you incentivize killing all the monsters? Like, what is it about it that makes it speedrunning?
I wouldn't mind chiming in here. That's an example since we're in a solution mode right now. I mean, it would literally be very simply sorted with challenges that you have to do to progress this type of content, right? It's not a map per se. It doesn't need to be displayed as a map. It doesn't need to be a linear progression of going from point A to point B, killing monsters along the way, making sure you survive and kill a boss. It could literally be anything. It could be that you go through stages. Suddenly there's a labyrinth you have to deal with, and you're time limited because you're going to take a damage over time effect, similar to like Delve Darkness. So maybe having a better region will allow you to spend more time doing that challenge. You can get to the next one, and all like stuff like that would be challenging. It's not necessarily saying that would be a good solution to it, but stuff like that would allow you to be in a position where a well-rounded character on both defensive and offensive and speed clearing, scaling would allow you to have challenging encounters that you have to go through that ramps up the higher difficulty you go for.
Interesting. So one of the concerns that players may have at the moment is that because you can specialize your map, like you can choose the mods and then you play that map, you can specialize in doing stuff your character is appropriate for. But with this system here, where you'd be given essentially random challenges, you'd have to have a character that can deal with a wide variety of different things. Like, what if I am slowed? Or what if there is immunity to some damage type or various other bits? What if there's high damage over time? Your well-rounded character would have to be able to deal with a variety of different circumstances.
To give you an example, I'm sure in D2 you're familiar with the fact that there's monsters in like Hell where you can't, like as a sorcerer, use frost spells and you need to spec into 2 trees. That's a diversity that you're building into your character, and that kind of makes you a more well-rounded build. One point I will highlight here. Pardon? You hate that? Yeah, that's fine. Don't make it immunity. I'm not advocating for immunities, but that's making your character more well-rounded. And one example I will give you here, and why Delve fails as a mechanic, is that you can brute force it by continually going through and over and over and over again with no penalty. So this system, you would essentially want it to reset your progress when you die and have to go from the start again and build up from whatever you were. And that would penalize characters that decide to use 500 life, because you can't just go in and get one shot over and over again until you eventually get lucky.
Yep. Okay. So fair enough. So you talk about this being endlessly scaled, and how does that affect rewards? Like, is the reward that you get to be on the leaderboard, or do we have to make endless scaling rewards themselves?
I feel like a reward should be there, but it should cap. Yeah. Again, back to maybe WoW's Mythic Plus, it caps 14, and that's pretty achievable by most people that are serious about the game, but there's people running 28s because they love to play, right? It's just fun.
It's that same feeling when you talk about the hard mode boots, Chris. When you're like, oh man, look at these 3 resist boots. That's the same feeling that people get from those leaderboards. And I think that segues really, really well onto the next question as well, Tino.
Estos tíos están hablando de que quieren un leaderboard para poder presumir de que están en el leaderboard.
For Delve, for Lab, like for speedrunning
Lo cual es justo. Han puesto el ejemplo del WoW. Tiene míticas que capean las recompensas a no sé qué nivel, pero la gente hace el doble o el triple del nivel simplemente por la chapita.
Because it's sort of a challenge thing that can keep you going for longer in the league.
Dice que sí, que te recompensas. Están sugiriendo contenido aspiracional. Llevan un rato hablando de un contenido que puedas hacer infinitamente, que no sean mapas, que puedas, por ejemplo, tradear por una key y entrar y tu pompa para chequear el nivel de tu equipo y tal, para decir, vale, mejorado. ¿A qué nivel llego de este contenido nuevo? Me he comprado la multistrike Awakening, llegaré al nivel 20, antes llegaba al 17 y así. Y capean las recompensas para que no sea una locura, pero tiene un leaderboard para que tú veas tu progreso y te compares con los demás.
Inevitably, or at least hopefully soon, we're going to see some guild changes, which might be very interesting to look into.
Por ejemplo, un simulacro infinito que no tiene recompensas después del 20.
Well, you're the fastest on that, or you've achieved this and that goal in this aspirational.
Un icono, una chapa, lo que sea.
Claro, pero en ese sentido, si tú sabes que alguien ha llegado al nivel 50 de simulacro, ya tienes una build que copiar.
Right now, aspirational content is very limited.
¿Has visto qué es lo que funciona en el simulacro? Es una forma de destacar, lo ha hecho antes Cris. Entonces, si tienes 5 modos de in-game, estás decidiendo cuáles son las mejores builds para cada uno de esos 5 modos de in-game, que es lo que pasa en Diablo.
Sí, es verdad, pero eso es otro problema. El problema que están tratando ahora es que ahora mismo no hay ningún contenido para que tú hagas una build de 200 artes, de 500 artes. No tenías una build tan cara porque no hay nada que hacer. ¿Para qué? Lo que tú decías. ¿Para qué me voy a comprar el Headhunter? ¿Para correr los mapas más rápido? Si los corro igual. Algo que no puedas hacer si no tienes X.
Pero es que ahí ha dicho que en el 3.17 vienen los sube, que sin esas builds no los vamos a poder hacer. Y que además ha dicho en la primera liga
cosas, para que no solo haga... Pero están ofreciendo más ideas, más cosas.
Ways you have of ranking players, the more games you have at the same time, right? Like, you know, it's almost free content there, and there's this funny thing where I have a lot of friends who play WoW, and they're all in the best guild on their server. Like, but they can't all be, but yet they all are. Like, you ask a WoW player what guild you're in, they say number 1 on Blast server, but there's a lot of other guilds. And that's because there's always some metric for how they rate, how they, you know, assess themselves as number 1. They're number 1 because they did such and such first, and therefore they're number 1, even though they're number 6 in the next time that was measured. And so, I feel that by having more leaderboards, we have more ways that you can be number 1 in Path of Exile. This question you have here of a profiling game where you can kind of pin, you know, EP and stuff, as you say. Why am I saying things like that when there's a remix going to be made? I fall into the trap. It's meant to be used.
We got him, boys.
We got him.
Great. Anyway, so with regard to a profile that you can pin things to, this is something I've been putting a lot of thought to recently, because, like, the thing you said earlier about having a star next to your name on the trade site, that's fascinating. Having it so when someone sees your name on the trade site, they can see achievements you've had in game, and then on the forum or wherever community resources we have, you can see it there, and then potentially in the actual game client when you're messaging someone or seeing them in the guild, and a small pop-up that says potentially, you know, which significant accomplishments, aspirational things they've completed. It gives you a reason to tick them all off. Like, it means you're pretty much done with the league, but you've got three out of 4 of the major things finished, so you get the ability to go, I'm making a new character, specialize around this really hard delve-like thing, do it, tick that one off. I got all of them this league, and I got 38 of the 40 challenges, and I bought the supporter pack. The ability to show off all of the different ways that you've, involved yourself with that particular league could be really good. And so, yeah, this is certainly prompting quite a lot of thought internally at the moment. Yeah. Having said that, we don't have content ready for there to be leaderboards yet. Maybe there are leaderboards we can add for existing content for tracking things. And there was one question I had. This is an idea from like literally 10 years ago that we never did from a monetization point of view. But there was discussion of having it so that you can pay to get a microtransaction that you apply to a certain item that counts something that you've achieved with that item. Like, I don't know, number of kills or experience gained, or maybe something more interesting than that. And then that goes on the leaderboard.
Una idea que tuvieron hace 10 años, pero que nunca han puesto en marcha
money that you're paying there puts you in that leaderboard for this thing that you care about. Which I understand monetized features aren't necessarily great, but we are always looking for ways to continue to fund development.
Rollo, contarle el número de veces que he matado algo, o que me han matado, o el número de veces que he completado mapas live, y que en base a quien haya comprado ese ítem y al contador se haga un ranking.
I think that undermines the
Si
value
yo, por
of
ejemplo,
it
quiero
because,
competir
if you're number
en
one but you didn't buy the
número
item,
de
then
nodos,
the
me
guy who's number
comprometen
two
que
who
me
bought
cuente el
it
número de nodos que he
is
hecho y
better than you,
compito en
right?
eso.
I think...
Yeah, I see what you're saying, that it becomes a thing you have to pay for if you want to engage with that content, but it is kind of an optional side system.
Es
I mean, why
totalmente
not?
opcional,
As long as
pero
it's
sí hay que
optional
pagar para entrar.
stuff, right? I think that's completely fine. Like, yeah, monsters killed or something like that, then I would say that's okay. But if it's like actual aspirational content, I feel that has to be, because even if you're not gonna, for example, like if I download League of Legends and I see a pro and I'm like, I could become him. I don't have to be rich, or I don't have to, you know, be privileged. Maybe in some situations you do, but essentially, like, you could become him, and just that feeling means that it's something that you could grind for realistically, or maybe not, but you know, you look forward to that.
I think the
Hence
fantasy here...
aspiration.
Oh, go ahead, Tris, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'd want to add leaderboards to the game for the sake of it anyway. The discussion of a microtransaction for certain items would just be to track whatever those items can track.
Al margen de las microtransacciones, sí que me gustaría meter la del Wars en el juego.
That wasn't at all what I was suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's really cool. Okay, so the scenario which I think you're describing is I invite Tai Killer to trade with me, and he's got this badass frame, man, because he's got the fastest Kitava kill. That's awesome. And then he also rolls up in his helmet, which is bought from the MTX Cris store, and it's empowered because he's rank 1 as well. Is that the kind of thing you're going for here?
Well, it was more that it's not that the MTX got better because he was rank 1. The tricky part about that is that we're putting a lot of microtransaction work into something that only one player gets to have, as it were. It's more that you take, this is a lame example, and it's because all the examples are lame that we haven't done this. But for example, I take a shield, and it counts how many times I've blocked or something like that. You know, a thing that we can track with your items. How many times you've crit with whatever.
Escudo,
and you just grind the hell out of that particular item. And there's some leaderboard of this. And we thought, until we come up with a good idea for what's actually fun to track there, there's no point in doing this. Because the number of times you've blocked or whatever is pretty lame, because you can just, like, AFK and a bunch of monsters.
Sí, claro, hay cosas que como que haces AFK y no vale la pena hacer un ranking de eso.
Some stats that can be tracked on your items.
Tiene que ser cosas que traqueen, que sean
How many
interesantes.
exalted orbs you've dropped? People post that shit in their notes all day long.
True.
Yeah.
Exalts, divines.
¿Cuántos exaltes me han caído? ¿Cuántos divines?
Like a menu for it, but like we talked about having it gated on purchasable MTX, and like I don't mind that on some aspects, but I also think that it should be accessible to some degree for free. For example, maybe gated behind a challenge rewards each league, you get access to
no pagando, pero si me
like
pones
that,
el
so people
contador
have
detrás de algún
access to
tipo
not
de
being forced to buy it
misión
if they want one of
secundaria o
them.
algo así que
But
yo pueda
something
elegir
that I
hacer.
would rather have, like I like this as well.
Dice
But something that I would
que un
want
poquito
is
de
I would be able
eso
to purchase,
sea gratis y el resto pagado.
you know, for
Que un poquito lo tiene que dar gratis.
Please.
Como lo del
Don't follow
puntero.
the wings prices because they're pretty
Que han debido
ridiculous.
vender una mierda.
Like I want to be able to put an MTX on an item that says this was crafted by Gansy TV. I want that.
That's cool.
And I want to be able to mirror service that, so when people mirror it, can I have my goddamn name at the bottom. I want that. That's aspirational for crafters.
Yeah,
That's
like a
actually cool.
brand. Yeah, like a brand.
Yeah, like just
Stamp an item.
tramp stamp my chest. That's what I want.
La verdad es que sí.
Yeah. I think it'd be cool.
Yeah, that is interesting. There is a like.
Go ahead.
Poner el tatuaje de puta a su objeto para que cuando lo mire la gente, o sea, que se pues salga su nombre en el objeto para que cuando lo mire la gente tenga su nombre.
Ways that we can sell microtransactions, and the topic came up of the ability to pay money to mark an item.
Un contador de clics y pones a un jugador de Nemesis a contarlo.
And the problem is that adds value to the tradable value of the item, right? If this was crafted by you, and people know it because of that thing that you've paid for, it is now worth more, and therefore they will pay more currency for you. And so you've essentially put money in to add value to your item that you will receive currency for. And that crossed a line. Like, to us, that was essentially slightly akin to selling currency indirectly. And so we have to make it a free feature. It would have to be a thing where everyone had equal access to see who crafted the item or whatever, so that it wasn't a thing that involved real money.
Could you not make it like something that you could like just like have it like crafted by Gazzy TV, and then maybe you could like gild it with like kind of a consumable or something like that?
Well, as long as the thing that you're paying for here is not something that makes the item more desirable in trade. Like, an example is those progress trackers I was talking about before, they would not be tradable. They would drop off at the point that it's traded. So if I take a shield and I put a progress tracker on it and count my blocks or whatever lame thing I was suggesting, then that's not a shield I can then trade to someone else of value because I've paid that money. Unfortunately, it's just for me to track it myself.
Vale.
And so we really
No
want
se
to
podían
keep a clear line
comercializar
there.
estos trackers.
Even if my only role at the company is
para mí,
preventing
para
that
dar mi
slippery
progresión.
slope of the game pseudo RMTing itself into death, of it's still important that we make sure to not accidentally introduce micros that allow that kind of behavior.
You know, as much as it would have been cool, it's honestly very nice to hear that you're thinking about these things. Because as a player, obviously, we have pretty narrow points of view in regards to these things, but it's really reassuring to hear that you're actually thinking about this stuff, because I think the players don't want that either. We don't want pseudo RMT in the game. Yeah.
I think it's actually fairly interesting. Because we have the time, I'm going to ask this question.
Claro, pero es que
no
podemos poner eso. Ha dicho, alguien le han sugerido, por favor, deja de poner mi nombre a una cosa que he crafteado. Y ha dicho, claro, podríamos hacer eso, pero entonces a lo mejor alguien pagaba más currency porque lleva tu nombre de Nicro, porque tengo algo crafteado por Nicro, hecho por Nicro. Y entonces estás pagando dinero para obtener currency.
Telling people how the sausage is made makes them not want to eat it in some cases. But I don't know the specifics of exactly how the game is played in certain situations. I wish I had more time to play it myself. A lot of my time is spent playing the mode that cannot be named. But there are cases I didn't know. Like, for example, someone recently showed me a build where in Delve the person could take no damage. And therefore from that I assumed that is how people are playing Delve. I knew there was a narrow set of builds, and I saw this build was invulnerable and assumed all the players are invulnerable, when it's the literal opposite of that. And so me asking questions like, please tell me how that's played, or what do you think about this, actually means that I'm learning. And of course, I could do this on my own time. I don't have to have an audience of 11,000 people watching me learn the game. It's probably bad for me to expose that, but it is necessary to get education from the players as well as from staff, because staff play the game in their own specific ways. They all have their own experiences, and to some extent those experiences are colored by the fact they've worked on the game, so they kind of know how things work. Like, staff never tell me anything's confusing because they were involved in its development and were in the meetings that designed
no me dicen que nada sea confuso. Players
will certainly say to me, I don't actually understand how this thing works.
Crafting, yep, that's confusing, I'll tell you that much.
It's actually fascinating to hear that they don't think it's confusing with how in
Es que el staff no piensa que sea confuso, no es que tienen la receta en la mano.
Yeah.
So that's
I should note, by the way, that the person at our studio who has the title Game Director, that's Mark, aka Neon, does play the game in an inordinately large amount of time and knows everything backwards and has done the deep delving and done the juiced maps and has played the Ourobots and so on and so on. He knows all the things and is therefore the person actually making these decisions. Like yesterday, he came to me and said, hey, Cris, real quick, I'm going to run you through the balance changes we're making for a bunch of, like, this is skill adjustments in 3.16, like which of the new 19 skills are getting small buffs or small nerfs to fix up first league feedback. And he runs through the list and I go, okay, that sounds good. I'm pleased there aren't as many nerfs as I was fearing there. That's positive.
Acabo de hablar de los nerfeos a las 19 nuevas gemas que presentaron en 3.15, ¿no?
Skill? And that was pretty much my feedback of just, you know what you're doing, you can make these changes. He's told me just in case it violates any of my philosophies or whatever. And because eventually I have to come on the podcast and defend that set of changes, like if we're massively buffing Absolution or something, then that needs to be something I can explain to people when they're angry about it. I'm kidding.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing is Forbidden Right nerfed. Okay, gotcha.
Hasta luego, Forbidden.
Forbidden Right totems are on the list to be adjusted downwards yet. And I think that no one's going to be surprised by that one.
No, a nadie le va a sorprender que nerfeen Forbidden Right.
I really want to improve how we're handling our communication of this kind of stuff as well.
Acabo de decir, están en la lista de ser nerfeados y creo que nadie les sorprende.
This is a surprise to her hearing this, but I think there's a bunch of improvements we can make about communication of patch notes and balance manifesto kind of stuff for these nerfs. And like, it is because yesterday when Mark explained to me the reasons behind all the changes, I thought, this is so well explained. Like this exact thing here, which you've just said to me, I want to like channel that to the community because I'm left feeling the game is so much better after each change. But at the end of the day, whatever we do to announce this is going to come across as like a little bit out of context, if you know what I mean. Like if it's in the patch notes, it's going to be just a set of arbitrary changes and players will read that and go, I don't understand why these are happening. And there's certainly a big group of people that read the patch notes and have kind of missed the balance manifesto.
Leemos el parche, leemos los balances, pero no entendemos la justificación de muchos casos. Y este tío le hizo una explicación exacta de por qué esos 19 nerfs. O esos nerfs.
Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting now, but
no,
I do want to make communication about it.
It's good for us to understand.
No, van a nerfear más de una. Le he dicho que había varios nerfeos en las ediciones nuevas.
About builds. I'm not sure if we should get
Hay más de una que va a pegar tijerazo.
I'll let Jazzy take over because Steve's exactly up next.
Yeah, this is kind of going with skill and balance in general, and it's right now the best strategy for a lot of players in the acts is to play an actual leveling build and then swap to their intended style of play later. And this is the result of poor early skill gem scaling and damage availability. So the question is,
el sistema de leveo es una mierda. El escalado de las gemas es una mierda. Con lo cual la gente levea con algo y luego muta a otra cosa.
Oh, I have a philosophical answer for this one. So, we feel that good endgame builds work because they combine a skill with various tricks, right? Like, no one's just putting fireball in their character and shooting it at the monsters, right? You're doing crazy stuff, and that's why Path of Exile is fun. You're combining it with support gems, passives, ascendancies, keystones, threshold jewels, items, uniques, whatever it is, you're making that skill effective through some means. And so, what you're asking for here is that we balance skills to be really powerful without those tricks. You're wanting it so that a skill that requires tricks to work is also compelling to use in the playthrough without full access to those tricks. Now, players have the choice of what skill they want to play at various stages, and obviously they'll try to play the best skill that they can do. And that means when they're playing through the game, they are probably going to play the most effective way to level, and then later to play the most effective way to play the end game using all the tricks that are available. And so we don't feel that it's up to us to make sure that the end goal is that players only ever play one skill. Like, we feel that saying that the goal here is that you play one skill throughout the game that's the most powerful, and it's the same skill that's most powerful in the end game is probably a negative thing. So if we balanced a skill that lacks combos to do more damage because of the lack of these combos, and then later we introduced a combo, we wouldn't want to have to nerf a skill as a result. And there's always one skill that's going to be deemed the most efficient for players to use. Playing anything else is going to feel penalizing. Like, you're going to have a lot of pressure to play what you think is the best skill. And so if you're the type of player that's caught up in this psychology where you're feeling bad about playing the wrong thing, you probably should play the skill that makes you feel that you're the most efficient. It's not possible for us to have every skill psychologically feel equally powerful. There are various effects like the effects on it or the sound and so on which can affect how players perceive its power. And so well, this raises the question of, should there be skills or items in the game that are bad? And the answer, we believe, is actually it's okay for there to be. And I'm going to use a Magic the Gathering analogy here, because that's just behind hard mode in my list of irrelevant off-topic things I like to bring up and feel out of touch. With Magic cards, they print these cards, and a lot of them are kind of useless, right? Like, half the cards don't have an apparent use in top-tier decks. And they sit there for year after year after year until eventually they print a card that combos really well with the previous one and its value spikes up and people put it in decks and it looks really cool. And there are so many examples of this, right? Helm of Obedience, Leyline of Void, and so on. You know, Painter's Servant and Grindstone, all of these cool combos where individually if I told you what the card does, it would be laughable. Why would they make this? And then later the combo is so clever and that becomes a thing that people can play with. And we have the same thing in Path of Exile where you introduce an item and it sits there. And sometimes this is intentional, right? Like, you know, there are unique items that supporters are made in the game whose goal is to be a combo piece eventually. They throw it out there, you look at it and say, that is terrible. And then later on there's something that makes an awesome combo. And so we really don't want to get into... Well, we really like the fact there are hidden treasures in the game. There are skills that are waiting for something to combo with them, and we just leave them there. And sure, they're a bad choice to use by themselves, but that's okay. There's hundreds of other ones. There's hundreds of other unique items you can pick. And then one day when we introduce something that works well with it, that's just waiting to be discovered.
Que hay cosas malas que están hechas malas a posta porque en algún momento llegará algo que hará que se rompa.
Because we're constantly producing new stuff. And that works for Magic in a situation where on the paper version of the game, they can't actually nerf anything. Like, they can never go back and say, we're changing the numbers down because of the fact that we printed this other thing. The only button they've got is banning something, and that's used very sparingly. So we do have the ability to nerf stuff, but we don't want to rely on it. We would rather have a skill that's underpowered, and it just exists like that, and then people can discover a cool combo that works with it later without us having to react by going, whoa, 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 we're turning that down in response. Now, of course, we shouldn't be giving those bad gems as quest rewards, right? We shouldn't be saying to the new players, here is Flame Surge, enjoy that one.
Okay.
Good response.
You are using like mechanics, tricks and whatnot that you're combining to make an ability really good. Yet those things are gated behind specific uniques or specific support gems that became available a lot later. But if you look at the early stage of going through the campaign, there isn't a single ability in the game that you would use to have a cool mechanic with outside of extremely limited options, such as Orb of Storms in combination with, insert any lightning skill, for example, like Stormblast Mines is really nice with it, for example. So outside of that, you don't have many approaches where you're actually doing any combination. But at the same time, there are plenty of abilities that you have access to, and some that you also get as a skill quest reward in the early stage that is absolutely terrible to use. I mean, going in now, we know that Brutus don't have any minions. I know this was brought up, I think it was in the Cis interview, with, try using zombies to level through the first 3 acts, just using zombies as your main source of damage. You're going to hit a brick wall on Brutus to start with, because there's nothing to summon corpses with, because that doesn't come to level 16 with Desecrate. That's an example. So I think that the problem that the question is referring to is that people feel penalized with the access of not having the possibility to level with the build that they want to play with. They feel forced to level with a level build. And in more cases than not, more specific when it comes to minion builds,
se ven forzados a jugar determinadas mecánicas que no es la que ellos van a jugar, porque el simple entre que ellos van a jugar no escala, no va, no funciona. Los golems, los zombies durante el primer acto son inútiles.
Los golems y las únicos son minions.
Exactly, but you have to rework a big portion of your tree to
las
make that functional, to play the build you actually wanted to play. And you're saying that so if I understand you correctly, you're okay with this.
Claro, estás de acuerdo en que haya builds válidas para levear y builds válidas para in-game, pero no son las mismas.
Some complicated, expensive, difficult combo at the end of the game and then expect that skill to be the most efficient or a very efficient way to play through.
Sí, claro, es que si te las hago más eficientes luego en in-game, ¿qué haces con ellas?
People would still probably pick a leveling build and then switch over to be time efficient. Having said that, we don't want there to be bad skills, right? Like, we are trying to fix this. I'm not saying now we're going to leave the
No queremos que haya malas habilidades, vamos a fixearlo.
We're going through whenever we see these and making sure that they're compelling, right? Like, if it's a real problem that a new player says, I like zombies, and then they don't pick any other damage skills and they can't get past Brutus, that's an issue that we'll have to solve.
Sí, claro, tenemos que resolverlo. Si un jugador nuevo quiere jugar zombies, que pueda jugar zombies.
We should be solving the issue that whatever the best endgame skill is also has to be an efficient leveling skill.
Que aquellas habilidades que sean buenas en endgame tengan un buen escalado sería algo importante.
No, it just makes a lot of sense, but maybe I was thinking more rather than on the leveling aspect, instead of looking at skills like, oh, lightning tendrils needs to be buffed.
Que van ya 3 horas, ¿no? De podcast.
Like, as that as a whole, rather like self-casting or hand-casting and stuff.
Dos.
Or channeling.
¿No ha empezado a las 9?
Stuff like that.
A las 10,
A las 5.
And the team like to pick things like handcasting and then go nuts with it for an expansion in terms of making it better. This has happened a few in the past. Like, there was a handcasting one at one point, and this kind of requires constant maintenance. It does require us to come back to it occasionally and to say, let's review that again to try to make sure that it stays balanced.
I'm going to bring up a topic here. So, from my perspective, there's obviously a lot of people describing an apathetic experience with the campaign right now. And that could be a combination of things like, they play the same build, they don't engage with the lead mechanic because it's not efficient, time efficient, and they skip all of the content and go as fast as possible. Obviously this has been a topic that's brought up before, but you've just highlighted that you're not interested in changing one of the aspects, which is the same every time. Is there any sort of aspect or idea that you have philosophically or otherwise that you might be able to make people more interested in doing the campaign?
So we have the league mechanic present in every area throughout the campaign. We've even tried, Expedition was going to be in 50% of areas rather than 100%. For quite a while during its development, it was literally only in half the areas. And eventually we set it back to 100%. And this is partly because having the variety of the league mechanic occurring as you're playing the campaign does help prevent the campaign feel repetitive after this many years. And so point number 1 is, in order to make the campaign more interesting, we make sure there's a compelling league mechanic through it. 3.16's league mechanic is one that is not... I do not want to spoil this, gotta be very careful. It's a good one. Let's just go with that, and that's going to help people play through the content. They're going to enjoy it.
No es capaz de pensar en cómo hacerlo fácil y de qué es buena.
We're looking forward to that one. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is actual campaign interest levels. We felt prior to our scaryization of Act 1 that the campaign was a bit of a pushover, right? There was never a heart racing kind of moment in there, and so while there were some mistakes made, we've been generally pretty pleased with the scariness of Act 1 monsters and are continuing to do that. Our second goal, after making sure there's interesting different league content every time, is to make sure that the campaign actually involves paying attention and so on. obviously not a big problem for speedrunners. They still run through the campaign and get to maps basically as quickly. But the intention here is that the average player actually has more of a game when they're playing through, and it does feel different from release to release. Like, we were watching the reactions of people playing Act 1 in the most recent launch, and they were pretty happy with the excitement and, you know, the Brutus experience and various other factors. And we are pushing that as far through the game as we can do with each launch. So that will help keep it interesting. But the honest solution to the campaign is Path of Exile 2. And I feel I've answered this question on each podcast so far. But Path of Exile 2's campaign is just so much better, more sensibly laid out, more interesting, cool, epic stuff happens in the right places. It's just a better experience. And, like, there's a quality aspect to it too. We made Path of Exile 1's campaign on a shoestring budget. Like, Path of Exile 1's campaign probably cost less than $2 million to put together in total. Path of Exile 2's campaign burns $2 million each time I click my fingers. Like, it's costing dozens of millions of dollars to make this campaign.
Oh, no.
And that's going to be apparent. I know it's not just a matter of money equals fun, right? I get it doesn't work like that, but there's a lot of fun being injected with the fact that we can't afford to put so many cool touches there. There's stuff you only discover. And there's stuff you only discover on subsequent playthroughs. Like, our direction to the level design team has been massive variety of rooms and, like, topologies and so on. It feels like a very different experience each time you play through. Our goal is to keep it that way, so that it has a lot of the benefits that maps have. So it
los
feels
parches
almost
más
like
recientes que nos están contando es para dentro de 6 meses. Y los más viables para, o sea, para dentro de 3 meses. Y los más viables para dentro de 6. Y no para hablar de que PodCast va a ser increíble.
Anyway,
Que
long
sí, que
story.
te creo.
We do like the idea of having a campaign in
Pero-
these games. We know that games like Diablo 3 throw in the towel and just have an
Hazme
adventure mode
algo.
where you can just pick whatever area you're playing through. And that wasn't really of interest to us. We experimented with this. Path of Exile used to have a 4th difficulty level, which, back in the day after Merciless, which had a flat area level. This is like internal, well, not internal, it was public alpha at that stage, where all the areas in the 4th difficulty level were the same level. And the intention was you could play. If you wanted the ledge because of the straight layout, you just play in the ledge, and that's your reality. And we've experimented with
Pero esto es Diablo
various
3.
different types of
4 niveles diferentes de dificultad para superarlo.
and eventually settle on the map system. But we do like the idea of the player playing through a distinct storyline prior to getting up to maps.
Eso es Diablo 3 ahora mismo.
It's pretty good.
Está hablando, para quien no lo esté entendiendo, que en PoE 2 están planteando que la historia tenga 4 niveles de dificultad y cosas del estilo. Pero están todo el rato hablando de PoE 2, PoE 2, PoE 2.
No. Que antes lo hice, que se plantearon hacerlo así.
Claro.
Puedo hacer una historia.
or scenario in which grinding your games is going to offer an alternative to the campaign. Is that correct?
Que en el pasado se
I don't think
plantearon
I'd say
hacer
never,
eso de los
right?
4
That
niveles de
doesn't mean
dificultad y que el
spamming
último
emails
nivel de
about it, but, like,
dificultad fuera te
when
dejara
players
elegir
write
en
in and say,
área
I
como un
want to
Diablo
play the
3.
campaign with my first character and then use Endless Delve to unlock my second character in maps. We kind of roll our eyes and think, it's that quote from another game company, if you think you want this but you don't or something. That's kind of how we react. Is like, are you sure you want to play Endless Delve? It's kind of more boring than the campaign in some ways, right? Like, it's cool for a little while. And so, like, we get the fact that you've just played through the campaign and you want to play a new character and you've got to play through the campaign again. But our solution first is make the campaign good. We don't like giving up on
Claro,
stuff, right? We
no
don't wanna
queremos
just
que te salte
not
la
try to
campaña, queremos
improve
que la
it and just
campaña te
throw it away.
apetezca jugarla.
So
Y que te
maybe
haces un nuevo
if this
personaje,
fails 5 years
juegues
from
la
now in Path
campaña.
of Exile 2, if people are, you know, finding that campaign repetitive by
Y
that
que la
point,
campaña
and
de
we're done
Path
at
of
Path of
Exile 2 sea lo
ready or whatever
suficientemente
we're
buena
doing
para que
after
te
that,
apetezca jugarla.
then we can look at
O sea, el
alternative
error
things.
no
But
es
it's just a
obligarte a
long
jugar la
way
campaña, es
away.
que
We have
tú
a
no
lot of
quieres
plans
jugar la
in the
campaña.
meantime. And that was not an announcement of a sequel that doesn't exist to a sequel that isn't out, by the way.
Yep. I guess we'll just throw in
Hasta luego, Grimbro. Se ha quedado con esa carita el pobre.
No, se ha ido a la mierda Discord.
Ah, se ha ido todo, se les ha ido todo. Solo está el host.
Solo está Gatti.
What just happened?
No. Bueno, es hora de terminar el podcast.
F en el chat. Celebra September, ahorra un 20% en nuevas suscripciones mensuales y el regalo por tiempo limitado. Gente, que tenemos September.
Chris can adamantly say how we're not getting an auction house ever, so it makes Reddit happy.
Okay, I am back. So you got cut off just as you started, Grimroll. It was a European server. I changed it. I got a message from Vero as well. Yeah, I know, Vero. Thanks, man. It was in European. Should work now. Go, sorry.
Gazi, we can hear you double again.
Fuck. Try now?
That's good.
Perfect, go.
Me voy a la camita, gente. Mañana.
Que descanses, Alfie.
Chao, descansen.
Hasta mañana.
Yeah.
And then you
so when we said the question was basically, can we say never to an auction house for Path of Exile? And I started to split hairs and say, I don't actually hate the idea of having it so you can run an auction where you find an item and you want the top price for it, and it takes a week. And this isn't just a quick item acquisition thing for the people who want the item. It's a thing where it's like, the prestige item gets the most mirrors paid for it or whatever. There's value in doing that as a process. I mean, it's a bunch of implementation, but realistically, what people are asking for with an auction house is a player-run shop where there's buy now prices, where it's like a more easy exchange. Now, our solution is we acknowledge that trading for reagents used for mapping is frustrating and somewhat mandatory. And so when we're looking at the new endgame, we're going to make sure to bear that feedback in mind. That will help and ease the pressure off that. And we are happy with the level of frustration that occurs when trading for gear, because we feel it's negative if you can instantly snap your fingers and get the next best item for that slot.
I feel like a lot of the frustration comes from the fact that people feel like they're forced into engaging with trade to buy mass market supplies, right? Like, as you said, like maybe scarabs or whatever. Or I feel like personally it's generally fine if you're just buying like chisels and things like that, but market supplies which are not in abundance, right? And I feel like I do like the bidding on things idea. That's really cool. But I'm on the camp of being scared of an auction house because I feel like that gives machines too much power in that regard, right? Like, people botting and things like that, which is also a problem that you see regardless.
With buy now stores, absolutely, there's the problem where a person lists the item too cheap, so the bot buys it instantly, right? And the person lists an item too expensive, so it never sells. And so bots are kind of having the floor, and there's just players above there, depending on how right they are. And that's an issue. The bidding thing, where you actually have to bid up an item and you've got a week and there's no real way to cheese it, it's harder to bot that because the community have seen that item for an entire week by that point. Having said that, this isn't a feature announcement. This is just me hypothetically saying I don't hate a real auction house. I just hate what people think of as an auction house.
Something regarding bots, if possible. Because there's a lot of them in trade, and we can also feel that you do these ban waves, right? And they're huge, and they're very impactful, and we can see that in the economy. But it almost feels like at this very moment, they're getting really efficient at buying all the individual things and then listing them in bulk. And then eventually they're getting banned. But then all these items disappear from the economy. So in turn, the player base is sort of suffering from these huge ban waves.
Claro, nosotros sufrimos las oleadas de baneos porque cada vez que baneáis a los bots, que son los que nos trolean, todos esos ítems se pierden.
It's obviously good for us to take out the botting networks, right? Like the impacts. Okay, so what happens with bots is when people are able to play the game using low resource copies of the game that are just running by themselves, then it lowers the value per hour of your playtime down to theirs from an economic point of view. Right now, Path of Exile is being played by professional people who generally are not kids, right? Like Path of Exile is being played by people in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and they have opportunities
Está jugando
for their
gente con
time.
20, 30,
And so
40
if it was
años.
just those people playing, then RMT would not be an attractive thing for players because an Exalt will be worth a whole bunch of money because it represents a lot of your time as a professional adult that would otherwise be, being an engineer or something. But the problem with botting is that it means that because the bots can run basically for free, the cost of electricity, it's a free game and so on, that the value of the Exalt is a very small number of dollars, and it makes RMT attractive, and that means that people cheat easily and blah, blah, blah. So this is why we ban RMT and we stop the botting networks. And the collateral of this is the fact that the trade bots that they were using to gradually juice out profits and so on and launder items are stopped as a result. So I think everyone is in agreement that our efforts to stop botting are well-deserved efforts.
Tienen que parar el boteo, pero es que ahora mismo quien tradea o quien comercia con la currency son bots. Solo que te contestan y te hacen el trade.
And I think our solutions to help reduce the need for trade for various map reagents will probably help that problem a little bit.
Claro, porque les han preguntado sobre un auction house o algún tipo de casa de subastas, algo para hacer que funcione el comercio, porque ahora mismo lo manejan bots.
Go ahead, yeah.
Y cada vez que hacen una oleada de baneos nos pega una hostia en la economía.
Que él está a favor de una auction house, pero si es una casa de subastas como tal. Que tú ofreces un objeto, está X tiempo disponible y dices, pues yo ofrezco un exalte, pues él ofrece 2 exaltes y se lo lleva el más.
Así funcionaba con Diablo.
Eso sí, pero no una tienda que lo hace todo automático.
So that in itself also cuts out some of the gameplay that some people can experience regardless of what other people might think like, oh, you're just AFK.
It's completely true that the trade bots do prevent players from sitting there doing the flipping themselves. The good news is that from what we can see, the trade bots are not being run by actual players usually. The resources that are being put into the trade bots are by the large item syndicates that want to launder the items and get more liquidity and so on. And so, thankfully, we can ban those with some degree of a clean conscience that we're not really impacting any direct players, play experience.
Is there ever a world where they won't exist anymore?
Oh, yeah, frequently whenever we do the bans, it's just that we, takes a little while to detect them all again.
Yeah. Okay.
I do have a follow-up on this whole thing with auction house. Now, a few things to mention. This was brought up, 4 years ago in a trade manifesto, where you tackled this question, and despite already having a pretty firm state comment about this to the community, it's being asked to every league. Every league's been asked for, why don't you do this, why don't you do that? And we have been hammered with these questions as well. So I'm just going to say it one more time, just for the sake of getting the answers so everybody actually can hear it again after 4 years repeating this. Are we ever going to have an auction house in Path of Exile?
¿Alguna vez vamos a tener una casa de subastas Path of Exile?
I haven't heard for a while. Sorry, can I keep a straight face? I don't think we're going to have the type of auction house that players
Creo
want.
que no.
What about a trade bazaar? That's been recommended.
¿Qué tal un bazar de tradeo?
Oh, there's so many people who write in with that. They played some old school RPG and they want this trade area where everyone can stand and be a shop, and you just idle there and you choose what items you give prices for, and there are lots of non-auction house things that players suggest where they acknowledge the problems with an auction house and they write in and go, here's the thing, Chris, how about you can price some items and put them in your masters or your hideout. So you can list 10 items and you put prices on them, and only people who go to your hideout can buy those. So it's not like some crazy database. There's none of this bot abuse. How about that? And they come up with all of these suggestions. But at the end of the day, if you do that, the players are going to be like, this is annoying that I have to go to everyone's hideout. So they're going to make their own custom site that lets people import what their deals are. And suddenly there's some pseudo auction house scaffolding made. The only reason we have the current trade system working the way we do is because people automated the process of posting shops on our forum using items that were in stash tabs, and the entire thing grew from there until the point where people scraping our website to download the database of what are in people's shops was crushing the website to the degree where we had to provide an API in public stash tabs to facilitate these trade sites. And so the lesson we learned is that you do a small thing and the players will automate it to the extent where they get what they want. And so we have to be very careful to not open the door a little bit to some of these, because then they get the full auction house as a result.
Claro, que para quitarle presión al API tuvieron que hacer que cada jugador tuviera su stash tab para que cada jugador tuviera como su punto de lectura para la página.
De que ellos están dispuestos a dar su brazo a torcer aquí, pero lo tienen que hacer con extremo cuidado porque la gente siempre encuentra maneras y la gente lo va a acabar girando de manera que acabe lo que no quieren tener ellos, que es una tienda automática.
Which skills are on their radar in a given league and whether they need to be buffed or nerfed. So two previous examples of this were Blade Vortex on the nerf side and Spectral Shield Throw, which has been, a great success in the buff stories. Yeah.
So it's often
Pregunta, ¿qué determina si una skill hay que nerfearla o bufarla?
We don't want to have to react to people finding combos, but if it's too powerful, then we have to deal with it. And this can often involve re-engineering of how a skill works, where it stops the abusive combo without really being a nerf to the actual main skill. Like an example was, if you recall, back in the day, Mirror Arrow plus minion instability while on low life would instantly explode, and because the way we were doing the mirror arrow balance was that you had a 5x damage bonus and a 5x life bonus on the mirror arrow clone, that caused a 25% cumulative minion instability explosion instantly. And so our fix to this was, rather than giving a 5x life bonus, we gave damage reduction to the mirror arrow instead to kind of simulate armor and so on. And so that was a change there where we tried to stop, where we tried to fix a specific case without actually nerfing the skill. But there are some cases where the skill itself is just too powerful across the board. So the problem
no creo que me estés esperando a mí ni EPA ni Paco, pero yo creo que esta noche no voy a tocar más PoE.
And our question is, which would the community rather have? We nerf a popular skill, or we buff every other skill in the game and then make the monsters harder to compensate and the numbers just get bigger, and it's kind of the same thing. Because it feels like they want the latter. It feels like if we said, we're buffing every skill in the game apart from these three, and making the game hard, people would be like, yeah, I love it. But that's exactly the same as nerfing those three skills.
I think it's more an issue of mechanics, actually. So I think that numerical nerfs are fine. You know, obviously one-shotting, shaper, and all that stuff like is not desirable from a design perspective. But a lot of the issues people have are the mechanical changes with stuff like Winter Orb, Cast on Crit is the most recent example. And also, you know, if you go back as far as Val skills and even the removal of Soul Catcher as an ability to enable Val skills as well. So it kind of feels like, I think from the perspective of the community, that, you know, oh, that was a little bit too fun and crazy, let's completely remove that. Which in many cases, they're right. They were completely removed.
Yeah. I mean, we try not to remove fun. The no fun allowed meme has truth only as far as the fact that fun was completely breaking the game, right? Like, look at, like, you know, monster vacuum farming with Tormented Spirits, for example. That was literally ruining our servers. Like, I'm pretty sure there was an actual fire at some point. We try very hard not to remove fun entirely, but often what'll happen is we nerf something down or change the mechanics to the point where we feel it's still fun, and then because of the presence of the nerf, people aren't willing to try it anymore because it's been nerfed into the ground, and they move on to another abusive system. To some extent, there's always some other thing that's worth their time to invest in, so that becomes the focus, and the previous one gets put to the side.
I guess I'll rewind that a little bit, because while I agree with you, I understand that there is a lot of player psychology. There's a video that when it was circling around on Reddit, it was a certain content creator going through the history of his builds and talking about how fun they are. If you compare those builds to the power level that people are on now, even in the current play, it's actually not that crazy. You know, stuff like Valspark, it could exist, and it just seems to be against some sort of a philosophy of Val skills, that it's not allowed to exist. Is there any world in which, you know, maybe the items associated with that, like the Soul Catcher or the Ring and stuff like that, could just be a little bit rarer and still have those builds exist instead of just having them removed?
Maybe. I mean, look, I like the idea of there being rare stuff that makes you powerful. Like, look at Headhunter, right? The team want to nerf Headhunter a lot. And my answer is, it's the most famous iconic item in the game. Let's leave it powerful. Like, if we're making Headhunter not cool anymore, then why are people playing? So maybe the solution is that we bring back some old insane builds and just make them gated behind rarity. But we have to understand that that would come with extreme rarity. Like, people for some reason are happy with Headhunter being quite rare. But if there were more items like that were incredibly powerful, they would have to understand that these are items you can't expect to get.
Like, I don't agree with you.
I agree with that too.
Because there's Hateforge. Hateforge existed in the previous patch, and it was incredibly rare. It costed more than a Headhunter in many cases, and it was this insane, cool new chase build, the Val Lightning Strike build, which was completely obscene, and that was really, really awesome for that league. And I would be very curious to hear what your opinion is. Hateforge is still up in the air. We don't know if it's coming back. We don't know if it's going to retain its power. But if it did, I think it could sit right up next to Headhunter as a really awesome chase unique.
The question is whether this item is getting that due to intentional or unintentional interactions, whether they're intuitive or not. Headhunter does what it says, and it just says something stupid and powerful on it, which is cool. Hateforge, my understanding, and bear in mind, like, I didn't work on this directly, my understanding is that a lot of its interactions were not really intended on our side. Like, there were things the players worked out that were both unintuitive, or at least we felt were unintuitive and not intended. And so our plan there was for it to be powerful, but to make it work correctly like it's meant to. But look, I love the idea of stuff being powerful, right? Like, I'm pushing the team to make sure that there are good items. Our spec for the uniques in 3.16 is only good uniques, please, right? Like, we very much want to make sure that there are good things out there that are very valuable. I want it so that Path of Exile players are hoping to get one of many different types of Headhunters that do crazy stuff. And I think from the uniques that I've seen so far, there is some pretty awesome set of things people are going to like. But they have to expect these are going to be rare, very chase items. And chase, by that I mean valuable. I don't necessarily mean we stuck it on a specific boss and let you grind for that. Though in some cases we have actually made sure that there is a path to getting them that's deterministic, to have a fair share of determinism.
Understandable. I think I would advise you, Cris, to understand Hateforge and go to bat for it. I think that you would greatly enrich your game if you allowed that to exist in the patch that Ultimatum comes back.
Eso sí, yo, sí. Ya está.
I will have
Perdón.
a chat with the Hateforge.
No has sido tú.
Vale.
good.
The Hate Forge haters who also forged it.
I think it's an incredibly interesting item.
Incredibly interesting, but very build-defining for 2 builds, right? And
That's
what
okay,
I think
that's how it's
would be... Yeah, that's okay, right? But there should be things for more builds.
Ya está bastante
and
quemado el
more
podcast,
opportunity
también os
for other
adelanto.
builds to have
Lo
that
importante ya lo han
sort of
comentado.
thing, right?
Yeah, I
Which
think
is what I think. But I don't think Headhunter is that thing. Yeah, it's fun and all, but it's not like you put it on and that's your build, right? Whereas Hateforge, the cool thing about it was that like Hateforge is the build, whereas Headhunter is just a filler almost.
If I could compare Hateforge to something, Chris, it's Jace the Mind Sculptor, and softcore trade is modern. Okay, let us have Jace. It's an awesome card. Don't ban it, and give us more cards like Jace because that's badass. Everyone loves playing with OP stuff, you know. Maybe you bring the Ancient Reliquary Key back with legacy items and just make it really rare. There, you solve chase items in one go. I don't know if that's doable, but you know, it was pretty cool in Legacy League.
When it first was announced, we actually thought it was legacy items.
Yeah.
Like the people as a whole, we were like, "Are those legacy?
Yeah,
Is that legacy Soul Catcher?"
Yeah.
We were all like,
we
excited about that.
Yeah, I think that could be interesting. But yeah, anyway, tangent.
How did you feel about the rarity of the Reliquary Key in the last league? Like, ignoring what items it gave, how do you feel about its actual rarity? Was it sufficiently rare?
It wasn't rare enough.
I dropped more of them than I dropped Exalted Orbs.
It wasn't rare enough.
Sí, está el
And
point en
also,
crisis. Ha perdido
for
más de la
some
mitad de los
reason,
jugadores en
it was
4
tied to
semanas.
it being a currency, and if you ran like, for example, Nemesis 3, you would drop 3 per map or something, which was weird, right? Because I ended up having like
Map item.
Right, but it was dropping for Nemesis 3, or maybe it was just because I was having so much. I didn't really have much quant, but it just felt like it was dropping so much when I was doing specifically Nemesis 3.
I think it's okay to be incredibly rare, especially if you're not waiting the drop pool, like you said, Chris. But I think bringing back legacy uniques, the sheer portfolio of uniques in there is incredible. You know, stuff like the Quant Gem. I still hear players like Zizaran talking about his heyday in Legacy, where he had the Quant Gem and he was playing with animate, weapon, poison build, and it was so much fun. And then you've got stuff like Legacy Combs and all sorts of stuff like that. It just enables insanity in your game and really does give you that high-end modern kind of feel. And it's very, very exciting to kind of think of that.
Liadlo, que lo
I
haga.
get that. We're probably not bringing back the item quantity support gem though, for
Fair
reasons
enough.
that may be obvious.
Yep.
Yeah. So if we are doing something like that where we bring back either legacy or just, you know, have chase uniques that are accessible like that, it just needs to be understood that these are ones where you don't start the league out planning a build around it and then getting angry when you don't have that thing. It really has to be the mindset of you playing a build that you expect you actually can get the tools for. And then if you luck into one of these things, you just re-roll and do that and have a great time. We're fine with power existing there, but often
Pero permite eso.
it's fascinating as well to look at new
Dice,
Path of Exile
no queremos
communities.
que
Like
sea
when the
algo que
Chinese server
planees al
crops up or
principio
the
de la
Korean
liga,
server,
pero si
the
te lo
players say,
encuentras,
okay, this is a game
roleas
that's
y
got
te
a
lo pasas
decade of
pipa con
experience
tu
behind it. How do we play?
este.
What do we do? What are the builds? And someone enterprising comes along and says, guys, I'm going to translate a bunch of build guides for you. These are the build guides. And they put one out there that's a good leveling build, and they put another out there that's a good one you can move to afterwards, and then they put one out there that's aspirational that requires the best items. So it's got a headhunter, it's got all the things. And then the players who are very inexperienced with the game because they haven't played before look at these builds and they see the headhunter one or whatever in some crazy build that's expensive and out of reach, and they say, I like that one a lot. That actually looks a lot more powerful, to be honest, than the easy leveling one. Like, honestly, look at the video, that's really good. And so they try to play that build and are missing like the headhunter, and then the complaint is like, how do I get this? Which vendor do I buy it from, or whatever? And there's just a massive gap in expectation there. So expectation management is the key thing with rewards. Our players on our server understand that headhunter is very difficult to obtain, and they plan their builds around that. But sometimes a new player, when they look at a set of build guides, will not necessarily understand that. So yeah, this is a topic we talk about a lot with chase items and so on. We want to make sure they exist. We just want to make sure that players understand that they're a luxury that they'll occasionally get, and then the reason to play the game is maybe they'll have the privilege of getting to use one of these items, as opposed to being angry that they didn't get 3 of them that league.
I would
I
urge
feel
you.
like that's an issue on the. It's the content creator's fault for presenting it that way, right?
Yeah,
Because if I were to present a build and be like, oh, here it is. This is the build. It has a headhunter, mirrored uniques, or like mirrored rares. Like, have fun. Like, people will get really, really mad at me if I don't give them the option of like, this is why you can use it as an alternative, right? So when they present like a build like that, they have to stamp it as like caution, you can't play this. And you
Estoy
can't
diciendo
plan
que hay
it.
un problema con la
I feel like
expectación, que
I
ellos
don't think you
están
guys should
encantados
take
de hacer eso,
that
pero que hay
burden of
una
responsibility.
que hay
Well,
un
and
problema con la
yourself from creating
expectación.
cool
Y está
items
diciendo
because of
Tuna que el
It's tricky
problema
though,
de eso
because
no
we're
lo
the
tiene
ones blamed
y que
by
ellos
the
deberían ser libres de
player,
hacer
who's
eso.
like,
El problema que
this
tiene
game was
eso
bad, I couldn't get
son
what I
los
wanted. We can't
creadores de
police the
contenido que
content
tienen
creators
que
and say to
ofrecer
them,
las cosas
we're
en
going to
plan.
take your build guide
Esta es
down,
la
let's
build
give an
super loca que
appropriate
es super
disclaimer,
cara
you know, blah, blah, blah.
y esta es la forma de cómo yo he
It might be
llegado a
really
ella con
tricky.
estas
Like,
otras
as a-
builds más baratas.
Claro.
Sorry, go ahead.
O sea, eso tiene,
Oh,
es
okay.
el trabajo
I
de
was
los
gonna say, I
creadores de
think you can-
contenido.
it's very
GG tiene
shocking.
que
It's-
poner
you
en
can't do it in
disponibilidad
such a
estos
way,
ítems super
where
locos
you
que hacen que
design
te lo
it.
pases pipa.
I'll use another
Y los
machine
creadores de
learning
contenido
example.
tienen que
the
decir,
modern
mira, este es
packs
el
where
objeto
they're
super
a pack,
loco
they're a pack of
que he
cards,
conseguido un
but they
mes
cost like
farmeando
$60,
y estas son las
right?
bits más baratas
And
que
it's like, oh
uso.
my god, okay, this pack is
No esperes
different.
que
And you do
conseguir
that with
todas de una.
rarity, and you do that with like thematics and feel and game feel, right? This is a big deal when you're opening one of these, and the items from them are incredibly rare, and you make them look a certain way, foiled or whatever, maybe like the replica uniques do. These are not normal items; they're legacy items, right? And I think you can build that up from an in-game perspective as well, and you can make it pretty apparent that these are not normal items.
I guess okay. So the reason I asked the reliquary key question is because the result was that the Val one was too common. Fair enough. Okay, so there was a problem with the numbers there, which is annoying, and I'll have to look into that. But if we took some insanely valuable items that are meant to be like 200 times rarer than that particular key, and we put them in the same, like it's the same type of mechanic, it's the same portal, it goes to the same area, it's got the same chest, the same effects, and you get the same type of item, but it's just legacy and powerful, it's probably going to cause people to have an expectation because they have done that so many times with the previous reliquary keys that they expect this to be of similar rarity. Like, it feels to me like helping with the psychology here is design a new area that has a new chest and a new effect and so on is a better way of symbolizing the fact that these ones here are actually insanity rare and insanity powerful.
You can go the full-on unintended route. You know what I would do if I was in your shoes? I would make the key a fish, and I'd make it take you to Krilson's underground layer, and there's a chest in there. So it's not even really part of the game. It's like so crazy and off the wall that these items come from there, and it's just like, you know, you're like, okay, this is basically dev items.
Now we're talking.
That's
I love our fishing stuff, but we do have to make sure that the stuff associated with the most aspirational items is as serious as possible, right? Like we kind of feel we have to take the game seriously.
But I mean, when it comes to like fishing, I mean, we have ways to fish exalted ores right now. All you have to
¿Se ha ido el sonido?
Lo he hecho aposta. Ha dicho, hay una manera de farmear, de pescar exaltes. Y es que lo que tienes que hacer es, y se ha muteado.
Hijo de puta.
Easily, you get that down to the mud flats, where you pick up the albino roa feather, and you just attach that by clicking.
I got 2 mirrors there.
But I mean, I think that's fine though.
I think you're still on mute.
The question I had before though was the regarding the content creators to get back to that. Sorry?
You're still on mute.
No, I'm not muted.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm not muted now. No, but like the content creator part with it, I think that we had, that was what you presented before, Chris, like with the issues with this is a massive problem that was in the past. But I feel like if you look at the content creators we have now, like when I started playing, I was one of the extremely few, if not one of the only ones that made a ton of minion guides back then. Now I got a lot more other non-minion builds since then, but it's like, look at the content creator market, if you will. Right now, we have plenty of other people making guides for these things that are, you know, really, really good. And I think that that's just grown into the position where more and more people are getting the information that, well, you can't expect to have a high-budget build. You have to start somewhere, right? And content creators are getting that as well, because the builds that are getting popular are essentially the ones that is holding your hand and guiding you from the start, and then moving into upgrading to the higher budgets. So I'm not sure if that's like a problem in that sense, but maybe it is when it comes to the point where an individual is translating it over to the non-English speaking countries, right, or the regions. But at the same time, I think that we're in a good par on that sense when it comes to the player expectation gap, if you will, at least on the on our region.
Yeah, fair enough. I haven't seen any problems with that on our region.
All right, just to bring it back a little bit, can you quickly talk about the mechanical power differences between skills such as totems versus melee, and how a lot of players are feeling like, you know, some archetypes are in a really bad place just mechanically. Like, you know, if you're trying to fight Cris as, like, you know, a melee character versus, you know, on totems, it's a completely different level of difficulty.
the team were aware of this, and I don't think we have any changes that we're ready to discuss there. Like, this isn't a thing we're targeting in 3.16. There's a totem change related to a good friend Forbidden Right, of course. But
vale, hay cambios en los totem,
understand
aparte de
that, like,
Forbidden
if you place a totem
Right.
down, it's able to attack while you're running around, whereas if you're a melee character, you have to be standing still, and theoretically that means that we have the melee skills do more damage than the totem ones should, and so on. We're careful to not try to change too many balance systems at the same time, and 3.16 involves a lot of work as requested by the community, so this one just isn't in its scope. Players can make informed choices of what builds they want to play. There are still lots of players enjoying
ya no
playing
vamos a
melee
hacer
builds.
más
They just
nerfs.
find good ways for it to work, but
Momento,
I agree that
No los van a
mechanically,
hacer, dice que no
I
caben.
should note that I've basically only played melee Path of Exile on the live realm for a number of years now. Like, I would certainly
Acaba de decir que van a cambiar más totems aparte del Forbidden
like it
Right.
to be more powerful.
Que van a cambiar algo de los totems.
But there are other factors in play, and I think when the team come to doing it,
Porque le han dicho, no es lo mismo empezar jugando melee que empezar jugando
then they will definitely bear that in mind.
Que hay
totems.
desventajas.
Que la
Según qué
diferencia de
arquetipo
dificultad
coges,
es brutal.
tienes una serie de desventajas.
I guess
Igual
we
con
have
los
more
no
to
has
the next
visto ese
question
retraso
then.
medio año.
Unless you guys have anything else to chime in on, sorry. You're good?
There's a question maybe that I wanted to ask about how do you determine what is appropriate baseline skills adjustment level? Like, do you guys have a line? What's the bar in that regard?
So it's tricky because each skill is different than each other one, right? Like, there's
Igual mi
varying
nivel de
cast
inglés ya
times,
empieza a ser un
mana
poco
costs,
bajo para
support
esta
gem
parte
options,
porque no me estoy
special
enterando de la
tools,
mitad.
unique items, keystones, and so on. But
Cabe
taking that into
preguntar, ¿cuál es
account,
el
we try
nivel
to
mínimo
find
que debería llegar una skill?
we try to find appropriate comparison skills within the game. Like, the process of balancing involves saying, this thing is like
Es
this other
difícil
skill,
porque cada
but
skill es
there's these
diferente.
differences, and then to balance based on that. It's rare that we actually have to balance something entirely from scratch. And then from there, we playtest with a lot of different types of playtesters to make sure the skill feels good in different parts of the game. And the time.
Gente que está viendo el stream, ya estáis viendo el nivel de las preguntas ahora mismo. ¿A qué nivel debería llegar una habilidad? Esto ya es una charla entre colegas hablando de sus cosas. Las cosas interesantes tipo, ¿qué va a pasar con el tradeo? ¿Qué va a pasar con determinadas skills? ¿Qué va a pasar con el balance? ¿Cómo vais a plantear el tema de la venta? ¿Cómo vais a plantear en Liga Trade el hecho de que yo pueda conseguir un ítem? Si el ítem me vas a impedir craftearlo, ¿de qué manera lo voy a obtener? ¿Qué sentido tiene que me hagas más difícil el crafteo cuando en realidad quien se va a beneficiar de eso son los metacrafters y por tanto al final lo que vas a hacer es fomentar el negocio? ¿Cómo vas a tratar el tema de los bots? Toda la parte que yo creo que resulta más interesante de este podcast. Lo que tenía especial este podcast era que estos tres tíos son jugadores de Liga Trade, es decir, tú, yo, cualquiera de nosotros. Entonces, a partir de aquí, como estáis viendo, el nivel de la conversación está siendo vamos a aprovechar que tenemos aquí al jefe del juego y vamos a seguir dándole caña. Llevamos 2 horas 40 minutos de podcast y yo llevo ya 3 preguntas que entiendo que son bastante chorras. ¿Hasta qué punto os interesa que sigamos? No tengo nada mejor que hacer. Yo si chapo esto, seguramente me toque irme a la cama. Entonces, si queréis que sigamos escuchando esto y viendo si dicen algo interesante, adelante. Si no, lo que va a pasar va a ser que mañana pasado Toco se va a buscar el resumen, que lo van a tener subido de aquí a nada, y lo vamos a comentar. No está mal, es interesante, pero sinceramente llegados a este punto llevo ya un rato que he perdido el interés en el podcast. No os voy a mentir. De hecho, me habréis notado que he estado jugando hasta el puto Buscaminas. Taco, ¿tú consideras que es importante lo que está por venir? ¿Crees que puede quedar algo interesante de comentar?
Depende de tu interés en el juego. Claro, yo hago las builds, entonces me interesa lo que están hablando. Pero si tú no las haces, entiendo que no te interesa.
Hombre, que le pregunten cuál es la línea base del potencial de una habilidad. A nosotros en realidad, aunque hiciéramos las builds, nos da bastante igual. Luego tú
sí
coges la build, ves el escalado, lo metes en el pastebin.
Pero es que el pastebin no siempre te dice exacto lo que hace. Winter, la E of Winter esta no funciona en el pastebin por cómo funciona mecánicamente.
Bueno, pues vamos a hacer una cosa muy sencilla. Sois 260 personas. 1, seguimos con el podcast. 2, cerramos hasta mañana. Vosotros decidís. Si cerramos hasta mañana, mañana después de comer, porque yo por la mañana tengo que trabajar, lo que haremos será retomar... Hemos dicho 1, seguimos con el podcast, ¿no? Y hay un montón de unos, así que entiendo que seguimos con el podcast. Ya está. Yo he preguntado, habéis contestado, continuamos.
that's going onto the live servers. And sometimes there are fundamental changes to skills right
lo que ha dicho mientras Nico habló es que cada una se reevalúa y se desarrolla y se evalúa ella sola y luego se puede testear. Y que probablemente fuera un error hacer tantos skills de una hostia esta parche a la vez que cambiaban el balance. Porque era más probable que se le escaparan cosas y que para la 3.16, la próxima, van a añadir 5 skills o algo así más cerradas, más impactantes, pero como es mucho menos la cantidad, lo van a poder testear bastante mejor y esperan que no vuelva a pasar lo mismo que ha pasado esta liga con el Reaper, con el Absolution y con las demás skills que las han tenido que arreglar todas.
Salió mal, lo rebufaron, la cagaron porque se podía relanzar la habilidad 2 veces, lo renerfearon y entonces se ha quedado una cosa que no va mal, pero que ahora mismo el Reaper está un poco descompensado porque el Single Target lo parte por la mitad y Forbidden Rite más de lo mismo. Tienen como mínimo 2 habilidades que tienen que controlar. Entonces van a parchear estas o balancear estas 19 habilidades y de paso las 5 nuevas que saquen las van a llevar más testeadas para intentar no cagarla con los números.
It's tricky because, I mean, it all falls on me essentially here, that it's hard to run a studio. It's like playing an RTS that you're bad at. Like, you know, just the units go and do their own things and you have to retask them and the gold mine runs out. And it is difficult, but we're getting there and we are improving our process each time as we learn our mistakes.
Aprenden de los errores.
All right. I guess we'll just move on to the next one.
Siguiente pregunta.
Do you think a shaken meta is a good thing for the game? And what are the essential learnings from 3.15's balance changes?
So, a cool thing
¿Piensas que
about
reventar el meta es
Exile
buena
is
idea?
that it leverages for its
¿Y qué habéis
longevity
aprendido
the
del
variety
3.15?
of character builds that are possible. And we feel that if people had the same few perceived build options every league and they ended up playing the same character too many times, they'd get bored. But on the other hand, there are a lot of players who do want to play the same character. It's a point of comfort. It's a point where they like playing that. That's the playstyle. They're just going to play Cyclone or whatever. And they want some degree of similarity between various leagues. So we also have a group of players who like finding new viable builds in the meta. So we've got a lot of different people there who like experiencing the game in different ways. We do feel that there are players who do not play a league because they do not have compelling build guides available on day one.
Dicho,
So a problem with the
tenemos
shaken
gente
meta is if we
que quiere probar cosas
say
nuevas
everything's
siempre. Tenemos
different,
gente
then a
que le
person comes
gusta
to
tener
PodCast and goes,
su
right,
build
play some
segura a la
PodCast,
que
what's
van a
going
las
on with this
ligas y
expansion?
después
Cool,
prueban
Expedition
cosas.
itself looks
Y
fun.
tenemos
What build
gente que
should I
le
play?
gusta
Oh, there are
descubrir
no build
cosas
guides,
que antes no se usaban
there's
y
no
hacer
further
las metas.
information. The balance manifesto and patch notes haven't been posted. What's going on? And they don't actually know what to play, and therefore they may potentially skip it. They may say, oh, I'll look in a few weeks maybe, and then it's not interesting anymore and they don't play, or they wait for the next league. So we think it's very important that there are
Hay un montón de gente que pasa de las notas, se espera 2, 3, 4 semanas a que la gente haga las builds y las copia.
Now, one of the learnings we had from 3.15's balance changes are that we should communicate with the community much further in advance and communicate balance changes early. This is not just a matter of making sure people know what kind of builds are going to be good, but also to make sure that we don't miss anything, because as we've just discussed, you know, we're only human and
Pero lo que hemos aprendido en la 3.15 es que cuando hacemos cambios, sobre todo gordos, tenemos que comunicarlo con mucho más tiempo y discutirlo con la comunidad.
That if we are shaking the meta at all, there's plenty of time for the dust to settle a little bit on, you know, some thinking of what builds are going to be good. And the end result is we want to have a sense of security for players who want security with regard to their build being available, and a sense of discovery for players who want there to be new stuff to discover. We feel it is a fail if the old builds don't work, and we feel it is a fail if there's literally nothing new to find each time. So it has to be a balance.
Queremos que haya gente que encuentre cosas nuevas todas las ligas, pero queremos que la gente que se siente segura jugando sus builds se siga sintiendo segura jugando sus builds.
And every time he sends me, yep, cock, cast on crit. And I'm like, oh, okay. And believe it or not, this league's the first league he said he wasn't playing because you heavily nerfed cast on crit. Now, I understand, completely justifiable, and I'm well aware that cast on crit still functions. He wasn't aware of that, and he was scared away by the patch notes. Is there any world in which maybe you could show these builds working still, and maybe that you have tested them and they still do function? So players aren't kind of petrified and
un amigo mío siempre jugaba COG. Según las notas no parecías que volviera a jugar COG. ¿Hay alguna manera de que podáis enseñar vosotros que incluso cuando nerfeáis una skin sigue funcionando?
We said that in the live stream specifically, but then someone will read the patch notes instead, read the nerfs, and not get the reassurance, which is partly why I kind of want to combine the stuff a little bit together. There's also the thing where we don't really want to have to tell people how to play the game. Like, I agree the reassurance is probably good. We can make that video. But last time a couple of times now we've made videos to try to prove points, and we just get ripped apart.
De que está de acuerdo con esto, de asegurarte que la build no está destruida. Pero tampoco quieren decirte cómo jugar el juego.
De hecho, ya han confesado que hay recetas que no conocemos y mecánicas que no estamos explotando debidamente.
Yeah, we can make the videos if we need to, and it's interesting here when you say that your friend read the patch notes, because I know that may not be literal, that was the place where he found out about the nerf, but we have to be careful to make sure that everywhere that we communicate about a nerf, it includes the information about how actually it's not as bad as they think, and here's some information.
Cuando hablamos del nerfeo no queremos hablar exactamente de hasta qué punto lo hemos dejado destrozado o no. Queremos que lo experimentéis.
Someone who happens to have missed the live stream or not paid attention to that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, Tuna, I'm sure you can speak from this, and I can as well. When you nerf Blade Vortex, I haven't touched it since. I've tried on my standing character, and it's just...
Yeah. But in regards to custom crit, right? Not even I was sure whether it worked or not. And especially pre the mana changes, we don't actually know whether it would have been... You know, because now you just circumvent that by getting a lot of mana recovery one way or another, right? I don't think there's a way that they can actually... reassure us in that regard, right? Because a lot of the time, a lot of these solutions are found by like smart players just putting two and two together. And
it's the smart players thing there. Like when we say, "Oh, there's ways of getting the mana recovery to work, or there's ways of making it work," it's often that we've thought of a bunch of items that go together, and it kind of sucks to ruin the puzzle. Like to say to players, "Here's how you do it now." Like, what's the point of trying to find the build if it's just answered for you?
I do agree on that. I think a lot of finding those things as well is really fun as a player, but
que tampoco queremos
that's my perspective.
Llevar de la mano porque creemos que también es divertido para determinada gente resolver el puzzle y poner la vida a funcionar.
Mana on hit, and that just fixed it all apparently.
I find it rather interesting with the testing of the things, with the testing of the builds and whatnot, and not telling the community what to play. I mean, it sounds more like a job for us content creators. How about a solution to let us have like a private run where we can go in, test the builds, record them? That's a dream scenario for me.
I don't know.
There were two valid things I want to bring up there, right? So number one is because we work right up until the last day, it's hard to have a private realm that's actually good enough, like ready enough early. And the second thing is, as chat is saying, hell no. Now, the reason why they're saying hell no is because the streamers get to play in the same content as they do. Yeah. And if there's a private realm where a streamer gets to play early, even though they're making content, it does mean that they then get the ability to win the game, essentially. Yeah. They get the experience that lets them... Now, we have this rule, for example, on Alpha, where this is a relatively recent rule, where if we were to run like some league launch event where there's 20 grand to whoever can kill this new boss first, we've specifically said on Alpha, if you log in after this day that the boss is available or whatever content it is, you will not be eligible for that money, right? Like we're making sure that if a person has the ability to essentially train for something that's got like real life consequences, they're not eligible for it. And obviously it's still a bit of a gray area. There's still ways that they can get information and try to tell their friends and so on. So it's hard to find the line between testing the content sufficiently, including giving you guys the ability to make guides and stuff, and having it so there's a fair playing field for everyone else who takes Path of Exile really seriously.
I really don't think content creators should have that access, personally. I feel like that should lie more within your internal testing systems. But like the guides and stuff, I feel like we're in a good place right now, personally.
Yeah. On the other hand, talking about the meta shaking and whatnot, a question is being brought up quite often, to step away from that joke.
Básicamente,
can you explain in further detail why it's not feasible for GGG to simply add numerical buffs to underused skills to boost them into the meta?
Que lo tratan mucho cuidado y que, por ejemplo, la gente que testea el juego no puede participar en los concursos porque tiene ventaja.
We do in every expansion buff underused skills, right? Like, I'll go on some rant here about how it's hard and philosophically blah, 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 but at the end of the day, the balance guys sit there and get the list of underused skills and buff a bunch of them, right? Like, regardless of me whining philosophically about this question, they're still going to do what you're asking them to do. from a philosophical point of view, it's just that an underused skill may be waiting for its day in the sun. And if we buff it now, we have to nerf it later. Maybe that's okay, but it does mean we have to kind of reactively go, okay, well, there's nothing that combos with this now, we think, so we buff it. And then later on, something comes up, so we nerf it in response, or at the end of the league. It's not a particularly good process. I say that, though, and the teams still go and buff the stuff that needs buffs. So I think I'm just probably better off leaving them to do what they do, and sitting here with my philosophies myself.
I have a question regarding the way nerfs are done in PoE, because it seems a lot of the time if something is to be nerfed, even justifiably so, it's hit from like 4 different angles. Like it's on the chopping board and it's dies by the end of it. But why is there not like more of an approach of chipping away at something rather than completely just making it fall out of fashion?
Porque cuando nerfeáis determinadas cosas, lo destruís desde todos los ángulos en vez de cortarle un poco y ya está. Como le pasó a Blizzard, que le quitaron daño, rango, que las cargas duraban menos, todas las cosas a la vez.
110 or 115. It's still meant to be good. Like, our goal is to nerf it into strong rather than nerf it into bad. And so when the team believe that it does need multiple axes of nerfs, it's often better to do it all at once rather than gradually chip away, because otherwise you get the, you try to nerf this, but aha, it's still the best kind of feeling, which happens a lot of the time.
Claro, es que, por ejemplo, como pasó con los golems, intentamos nerfearlos y siguen siendo los mejores. Intentamos nerfearlos un poco más, siguen siendo los mejores.
We do actually go through and play a bunch of characters, and they believe those are the changes that are necessary.
But at the same time, there are a lot of builds that are going from meta to being, it's okay to use, and that's fine. But then we have the other aspect when you have builds that are meta or okay to use that are suddenly like, yeah, good luck using that. You're stupid for using that, or you should feel bad if you try to use that ability. Is that something that you philosophically are okay with as well?
Claro, ¿os sentís bien? Una build que está en meta y después de nerfearla se convierte en una build que, bueno, sigue funcionando bien, vale. Pero cuando es una build que estaba bien y pasa, bueno, suerte, o que era meta y pasa suerte jugando esto...
Some abilities just goes from hero to zero.
Hostia, 16% de los jugadores jugando Spectral sin throw,
There are lots of cases of skills that we nerfed and people said this is terrible and we don't want to use it anymore, and then they're now magically using it again just because they discovered that it's actually okay. Surprisingly many when we go through PoE.Ninja, we see things that people had complained about in the past. It could be that we've introduced some new unique or jewel or something like that combos with it, that's brought it back up again.
I think that's fair. Sometimes people just need to give things another shot, and maybe it's too expensive because of back to the whole niche argument. Sometimes niche builds are expensive, but I feel like there's a lot of validity in that statement for sure.
I think a lot of people are misunderstanding the concept of what an okay ability is, because I think that a lot of people just expect an okay ability to be something you can do without emptying your wallet and stealing your mother's credit card to make it work.
Everything, like serious juice max, everything. People expect it to do everything.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess a better question or a quick question would be, where's the break point of what an okay ability is supposed to be able to handle, according to your philosophy?
Well, this is the tricky thing, because it depends as well on aspirational content, right? Like, we're getting asked basically, there are a lot of skills that can't do the top content in the game. Should they be able to? Alongside, we need more top content in the game that requires potentially relatively narrow characters. I know you've talked about the Mythic Plus thing offering, needing well-rounded characters. I like that goal, but each aspirational endgame is inevitably going to have some form of specialization required, and that's going to exclude a lot of skills. I suspect, as much as I've said that I don't seem to understand Delve, I suspect that a good 90% of the game's skills are not being used in there, and likewise for other aspects. When we come up with Uber Blight, for example, that's probably going to involve some skills that aren't so relevant and others that are. And if players have an expectation that a skill is considered nerfed if it isn't going to work in those endgames, that
que va a haber skills especialmente para determinados endgames por cómo son, porque por ejemplo no vas a querer lo mismo para Delve, para Blight, o para un boss. Porque no es lo mismo una build, por ejemplo, lo que quería Nicro, una build que explotara, que funcionara de puta madre en el simulacro o en Blight, contra una build que a un bicho lo desintegre. Como en Sirius.
But I also do feel that even though
que inevitablemente van a haber skills mejores y peores por mucho que hagan ellos para hacer X o Y contenido.
I feel like sometimes maybe a heavy-handed approach to cycling meta is good. Maybe that's just my point of view, but I feel like if one build, it's like if you only do one thing ever. Like for example in Delve, it was always really fun to see that like, oh now brands are insane, and then you try them because Swift brand came out, right? So then you played brands in Delve for like a league or two. And then other things can take its place when something else cool new pops up, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, a lot of this seems like very positive, like, ebbs and flows of the build economy, as it were. You know, we really just want to throw the tools out there and have people find cool stuff, and ideally not have to adjust things. There'll be some nerfs and buffs to the new 19 skills we released recently because they, like, you know, they're quite new and they haven't really had full, you know, like, leagues and leagues and leagues of passes on them yet, but, you know, I suspect there'll be some buffs to underutilized skills like we normally do, but our goal here is very much to try to introduce new content to give people new options rather than fiddle with the old ones endlessly.
Well, that kind of
I really
sums
like
up.
how clusters did that as well. Just to put that out there. It's like the thing that you said that like there's a piece missing to the puzzle, and then it comes back in, and then it gives us more greater perspective on now this thing is enabled because of a new system that you've introduced. And I think that's a really, really cool thing about Path of Exile that we might not be seeing right now. So, wanted to props for that.
Yeah. I think this kind of sums up the skills and balances. We had a couple more questions, but I do believe we are running kind of short on time. So I think that we're just going to dive into the pretty much the last big question we have. I think it's how we should approach it, unless you guys want to chime in on anything else with skills and balance.
I'm good. There's a few things, other things that I need to talk about, but that's okay. I'll get to them off stream and get the answers out, hopefully.
Yeah, I feel that way. All right, Tuna, you want to go?
Yep. This very, very broad question, but it's something that I'm really passionate about, having come from very sandbox video games like EVE Online or whatever. But anyways, how would you determine the line for systems, whether they should be tradable versus non-tradable?
So, generally, tradable is better because it means the things you're earning have value, and it means you can specialize in what content you do. Like, for example, before the Temple of Atsuatl was tradable, that was the thing you just had to do. You build your temple, and then you play it. And if you didn't want to play the temple, you weren't really getting good like value out of it. What could you like invite a friend to come and play it with you? You know, you're basically just losing the value you work towards, which maybe means you don't want to do versions at all. So now that the Temple of Atsuatl is tradable, you can set one up, and maybe you're not interested in running it, you trade it to someone who is, and you get some currency that you then keep. And so we will side on the side of having stuff be tradable wherever possible. It's like how beasts are tradable. We went to the work of making it so you can itemize beasts in that league because we knew that having tradable beasts was probably a valuable thing. We didn't want it to necessarily be locked to the character. Now, the advantage of having something be non-tradable, aside from the fact that we can vacuum it up like metamorph organs or whatever because of the way that our item philosophies work, the advantage of something being non-tradable is that it forces the player to engage with that system. In the case of Delve, we wanted people to be able to trade for like the scarabs that let you delve more, but we still wanted it so every player had a reason to be playing some Delve. We're finding soul fights or earning Delve progression, and it wasn't just a thing that was either 0 or 100%. It's a good idea to do some Delve. That was an intentional thing. And that's what, as I mentioned before, what we're doing with Expedition. We've decided that interacting with the Expedition vendors is likely to be something that we want to make sure all players have equal access to, so it doesn't become a thing where one person just specializes in doing all the rod crafting for the whole economy and makes all the shoes. So the changes we're making to make the Expedition currency non-tradable will certainly help in that direction. But in general, you should assume new stuff will be tradable wherever possible. Now, one of the topics we brought up this time about the endgame stuff is the idea of reducing the requirements to use tradable stuff on maps. Like, currently, there's so much juice you can put in that can be traded, and that's cool. We're probably going to go with the philosophy of having the extra juice is tradable, like the luxury juice, and the stuff you're using to just, like, have normal control of your maps maybe is something you accumulate in a non-tradable way for simplicity and to reduce the burden on trade. This is not a promise. This is just literally a 10-minute conversation I had with Mark at one stage that we need to actually expand into a real design. So that's where we stand on that currently.
But not at the expense of the current juice levels, right? right?
I don't think the intention is to reduce the juice levels, right? Like,
Oh,
we know how that goes. Like, we're not sitting there going, this is an opportunity to reduce the fun the players are having, right? Like, it doesn't work like that. If fun is reduced, it's usually by accident.
Free juice.
I'm sure you have to work for it, you just won't have to trade for it, right?
I had a question
bueno,
to follow up on the tradable versus non-tradable thing. Because you have things that are non-tradable still in the game, even after the actual changes, right? We still have betrayal.
Por ejemplo, escarabajos de igual que acumulas misiones de este, escarabajos de Blight, de Abyss, las cosas que le metemos a los mapas con los estantes, con los escarabajos, con los rituales, que los vayas acumulando de algún modo, o que te los regale el juego de algún modo, y que lo que tú metas sea el lujo.
¿Cómo lujo?
Que, por ejemplo, si era un mapa, lo tenemos que buffar comprando cosas, el 80% de ese mapa sea gratis y tú tengas que poner el 20% tradeando.
Because we just talked about it. How is the people going to make their own shoes?
Y le han preguntado con miedo, pero ya que es gratis, vas a reducir gratis entre comillas, vas a reducir el jugo de los mapas. Dicen, la idea es que no.
O sea, donde ahora le están metiendo un escarabajo de Harvest que vale 15 chaos, lo vas a poder acumular de alguna manera para usarlo cuando tú quieras, como los Infused.
Exacto. Pero yo que sé, haces un Blight y casi te da un uso de Blight. Por ejemplo.
Itemized versus tradable are two subtly different things here, where we have non-itemized but still practically tradable things that involve some degree of scams or third-party discords and all of that kind of stuff, which is a good point. We don't really want people
Ojo, está hablando
to be
de
doing
TFT.
that to each other, nor do we want to have to go and support secure trade for these non-itemized stuff. Because it's possible for us to have like a special trade screen where you lock in a harvest craft on some side and the other person puts
hablando de una
posible, like World of Warcraft lockbox picking window or whatever.
Ventana de tradeo o algo así para cuando haces intercambio que veas lo que te está dando.
We could do all the work to do that. Currently, we're not planning to. Like that's.
Pero que no tienen intención de hacer tal cosa.
But it is a good topic to bring up.
I guess.
Could you not? Go ahead, Jesse.
I guess the only feasible question to ask, because I know this has been mentioned, and I know people have been on me about this to ask this, so I'm just going to say straight out since we get a straight answer on this, and I'm probably not going to do it. But the question is very simple. Are you okay with the fact that we have to do trades like this and that we have to risk losing our items to people stealing it? Is that something you're okay with? That's basically the question.
I'm not really okay with it. Like, the honest view on scamming in Path of Exile is that, like,
contento con el hecho de que
¿Estás de acuerdo con que timen a la gente, básicamente? Con que exista la posibilidad por una
y digamos que hacer sistemas de comercio malos que te dan riesgo de ser escameado.
Trade that at the wrong price because you have information. Technically
Eso es
ripping people
como
off because
si pones un ítem por el precio equivocado porque no sabes lo que vale.
That's how real economies work. You saying,
Que así es como funciona la economía de verdad.
Kill the boss for you if you give me an exalt and then not, like taking the exalt and running or whatever, it's kind of scummy. That behavior there where you promise to do something and then don't fulfill your end of it is something that I don't particularly want in the game. Like, I want there to be a knowledge disparity and I want people to get good or bad deals based on how much they've thought about things, but I don't want them stealing from each other. The problem is that, as it currently stands, we're left having to police this in customer support. And that's tricky because of false accusations and inefficiencies of logging. Like, we can see all of what's occurring, but customer support don't have that much granular ability to check game logs.
Pero no quiere algo en plan de que te pago un exalte porque me hagas silus y te vas corriendo con el exalte. O te doy mi objeto para que le tires una cosa de Harvest y te vas corriendo con el objeto, eso no.
So you lock the account, and then it turns out those 4 people are just his enemies or some shill group who have decided to try to like fake it. And there was no actual. When you look on the logs, nothing happened. They're all just laughing at each other in guild chat about how they've scammed this. They got this guy banned, and so it's really hard to police this stuff. Unfortunately, the solution of making it so everything is like fully tradable, so there's this concept of you locking in a boss kill deal with someone, where if you get me past Act 10 Katava, you get this item, and there's a special trade screen that understands the fact that you did that, blah, 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 is too difficult. So
claro, es muy difícil que puedas ponerlo como en un pack o en algún sitio donde lo bloqueas hasta que hagas tal cosa, y cuando ha pasado tal cosa se desbloquea. Eso a nivel técnico es muy difícil.
It's a process that doesn't necessarily involve a ban occurring if someone does do a single scam.
De hecho, no es necesario un desarrollo de ese tamaño porque a alguien le escamen alguna cosilla.
My rant went a bit off topic. I understand that the topic here is about crafting rather than boss carrying and stuff.
But not in regards to boss carrying. It's maybe just about relying on... Because like we have access to that because we're knowledgeable or whatever, but even if you've played like the video game for like maybe one league or whatever, like thinking about like, oh, I have to go on this website called TFT, unless someone tells you that, you're pretty much locked out of a lot of power, technically. I know it's perceived power because if you don't know, you don't know, right? But it's sort of like that's an end game within its own for a lot of people.
Estoy diciendo,
Yeah.
es injusto que exista TFT en el sentido de que si no conoces que existe TFT te estás perdiendo que te traen en pool, que las cosas estén más juntas, que te traen determinadas cosas. Que todo eso no debería estar fuera.
Han vuelto a nombrar Diablo 2, a ver.
And I think that's where the concern lies. I think, at least for me, rather more than the scamming, because I feel like people are generally
que no debería de estar fuera
pretty good on TFT.
De hecho, le preocupa más que el hecho de que
for the most part,
haya
but I also
scammers.
feel like as a content creator and a streamer, I think you all can agree that it's much easier for us to do. When I craft big items, I can demand collateral, and I can tell the guy that I'm not going to give this item for you to craft unless you give me 2
quiero
mirrors
comprar
to
100
do it.
haste
And I'm going to get people that has to craft and has the possibility to do that. So I can be very safe.
Dime una buena, Perception.
But I think the concern is coming from the majority of the player base that are
Y lo más eficiente es irme a TFT en vez de una herramienta dentro del juego.
Ahead of time on TFT, and they don't see that I'm content creator or anything like that, right? So I think TFT does a really good job at policing scam. And yeah, it can happen where if you trade to someone whose account is 1 day old and is like not even a trusted service provider or whatever, right? And yeah, it can happen. There's so many ways to circumvent that. But this is so often doesn't really involve you in the conversation, so sorry about that, Cris.
Yeah, that's okay. I've got to go in a sec, by the way. We've got a meeting coming up soon.
Yeah.
It's a good place to wrap it up.
Tuna, you have anything else you want to add, or you feel done as well?
I'm happy with that. I would like to see more tradable stuff.
Yeah, I feel the same on that one.
Yeah, I like tradable stuff as well. We just have to make sure it doesn't have the problems of too many splinters to pick up or too much trade required to progress maps and so on.
I think just to cap us off, really excited about the aspirational content stuff that we've talked about here. Hopefully we can see some of it in the future patches and in 3.17. Really pumped about that. Thank you so much from my point of view, Cris, for your time.
No worries. Thanks, guys, for arranging this.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, have a great day.
Yep, you too, and good luck in your next meeting. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Pues ahora sí que sí. Hasta luego, Cris, te queremos.
All right. Big thanks to now all the scenes are fucked, but that's fine. Big thanks to Grimro and Tuna tuning in as well. Oh, my head is actually the scene.
Thanks for having us on.
Pleasure having you on. I think that we did a pretty good job. I hope that we covered most of what the community wants us to bring up from a softcore trade perspective. I feel like we did the best that we could.
Yeah. I feel very
Vale. Bueno, pues gente, no hay mucho más que comentar. Ya habéis visto lo que ha pasado, habéis visto el podcast, habéis visto un poco los comentarios que se han hecho en el sentido de lo que creen que está por venir dentro de lo que sería esto. Han acabado con TFT y hablando de que quizá el objetivo o lo que ellos ven, lo que la gente que desarrolla el juego ve en TFT es el problema de los posibles escameos, y en paralelo, sin embargo, lo que está viendo la comunidad es que determinados trades, mira, os voy a ser sincero, hace 2 días que llevo yo buscando para el Endgame Greens mapas Blight, case de Alba y los logbooks 81 plus, y no hay forma de buscar eso en la página web oficial si no es de uno en uno. Hace 2 o 3 días que le he dado yo a Pauca o a quien sea, toma 5 Exalted, pásate por TFT y pilla lo que puedas, y directamente ahí le dices, oye, mira, es que resulta yo tengo yo lo que hago, de hecho me habréis visto hacerlo, es que si pongo todos en una pestaña, cuando alguien me viene a comprar uno le digo, tengo 15, y ese alguien coge y me dice, pues te compro los 15 y se los vendo, y eso lo he hecho yo un montón de veces, de hecho es mi forma de proceder. Pero hay gente que no funciona así, hay gente que directamente lo pone en la web de turno y ya está. Yo no estoy de acuerdo con eso porque creo que esa web ha excedido por muchísimo los límites y te está robando toneladas de horas de juego, pero quien esté de acuerdo que use lo que le dé la gana. en ese sentido, en la última parte del podcast lo que han estado comentando es a Cris o a la gente del equipo de GG les preocupa los posibles escameos o los trades no legítimos, mientras que a esta gente lo que le preocupa es que los servicios que no estaba dando Path of Exile y que por eso ha aparecido esa solución o esa herramienta, siguen sin estar disponibles para nadie que no conozca esa herramienta, y no tenéis por qué conocerla. Entonces, en ese sentido lo consideran... No sé, en ese sentido lo consideran diferente. Gente, no tiene mucho más. No sé si queréis comentar alguna cosilla antes de que vayamos dando por cerrado el stream de hoy y reaparezcamos mañana para seguir con los últimos logros. Pensábamos hacerlo, lo que pasa es que esta noche se nos alarga muchísimo el tema del podcast, porque teníamos pensado hacer esta noche, que para eso ha venido Epa a las 11, teníamos pensado hacer la última parte del Endgame Greens. Que la última parte del Endgame Greens, del último logro que nos quedaba, consiste en hacer 75 mapas Blight y 60 keys del Baal Omnited. Luego Pauca y yo iríamos a hacer los logbooks y las oleadas de simulacro para cargarnos ese logro, este y estos 4, junto con, que son los condicionales, junto con este que es el de completar un simulacro. Fijaos que el 100% de los logros que me quedan, todos ellos son el último logro y hacer logbooks. Fin, ya está. Con el último logro y hacer logbooks ya estaría. Ya los tendríamos todos. Y de hecho el último logro, la parte de Blight, la parte de simulacro y la parte del Baal, los tenemos todos comprados. Solo nos falta hacerlos un ratito. De modo que creo que, no sé, dependerá de cuánto tiempo perdamos en eso, pero si nos organizamos bien, quizá dependerá de cómo difícil sean los logros de los condicionales de los bosses, pero creo que se puede hacer relativamente rápido. Tengo por suerte el PDF que me leeré sobre el tema de cómo hacer determinados logros. También quiero traeros una cosa que ya veremos, que es que dentro de PodNinja, supongo que lo sabéis, pero aquí arriba está la sección Builds. Y dentro de la sección Builds tenemos la opción de ver qué es lo más jugado. Spectral Seed Throw es lo más jugado, luego tenemos Res Spectre, Forbidden Rite, Cyclone, porque se combina con muchas cosas. Entonces de aquí se pueden sacar Builds, se pueden sacar Paste Beans y de todo. Aquí tenemos, por ejemplo, una Forbidden Rite con 14 millones de daño. Aquí podemos ver, por ejemplo, qué está jugando la gente dentro de esta habilidad. Y de aquí podemos sacar diferentes configuraciones de diferentes builds que pueden ser interesantes. Aquí si molase, si hubiera forma de hacerlo interesante, podríamos tratar de montarnos alguna de estas builds y ver qué tal. Creo que en los próximos días, una vez que me termine esta build y que estoy a punto de acabarme los logros, ya sea ahora o sea después del parón que pegaremos para Diablo 2, vamos a reaparecer por aquí con alguna de estas cosas. Y jugaremos Forbidden Rite, y jugaremos Rise Spectre, y jugaremos todo lo que se nos ocurra. Creo que sería una buena oportunidad de probar también el Spectral Seed Throw. No sé si antes de que me vaya Diablo vamos a hacer el endgame stream, o si lo haremos después, no tengo ni idea, pero en cualquier caso me gustaría probar alguna de estas builds y junto con esto decirle a Taco, toma, pasta, y que investigue builds para que en la liga que viene podamos hacer cosas chulas testeadas. No habrá canjes de guild, no se ha cumplido el requisito, así que mañana cuando se cumpla lo haremos. Dicho eso, no sé si queréis decir algo más, pero como aparentemente está la cosa ya tranquila. ¿Taco?
Por mí está bien.
¿Satisfecho con cómo ha quedado el stream? El podcast.
Sí.
Bueno, pues gente que estéis por el stream, espero que hayáis disfrutado del contenido, que hayáis disfrutado de haber visto este podcast. Para quien se haya perdido por el hecho de que era en inglés y era un poquito complejo, suelen subir un resumen y nosotros lo que hacemos es que lo traducimos y lo comentamos. Así que seguramente mañana pasado lo estaremos comentando aquí en directo. Un poquito más, un abrazo y nos vemos.